Section 1. The world before the fire. Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull whatever you have around you a little closer and let the outside world start to fade. Over the next couple of hours, we are going to walk slowly, quietly, through one of the most richly imagined fictional universes ever built. The world of Fallout. Not the chaos of it, not the gunfire. The stories underneath all of that. The human ones, the quiet ones. The ones you only find when you stop long enough to read a dusty terminal or listen to the static crackle of a decades-old holotape. Those are the ones worth telling. So let the room go dark around you. Let the sounds of your house settle. And come with me to a world that both is and is not our own. Before there was a wasteland, there was a world. Picture America in the mid-21st century, except the version of it that never quite happened. A world where the cultural clock stopped somewhere around 1950 and the technology kept marching forward anyway. A world of chrome and atomic optimism, of drive-in restaurants serving synthetic burgers under neon signs, of television commercials promising a brighter tomorrow powered by the clean, limitless energy of the atom. The music was full of brass and swing. The cars were enormous and low-slung, styled with fins and gleaming like sculptures. The advertisements were cheerful to the point of being surreal. Smiling families gesturing at nuclear-powered refrigerators. Children playing with robot toys. Everyone well-fed, well-dressed, and blissfully, impossibly certain that everything was going to be fine. It wasn't fine. The Fallout universe sits in a world that diverged from our own history sometime after World War II. The big events remained mostly parallel. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then the Cold War took hold with its particular frozen terror, and then the world moved forward. But the technology went in a different direction. In our world, the digital revolution came first. Computers shrank, transistors miniaturized, the internet was born. In Fallout's world, the atom was mastered first, and everything else radiated outward from that central achievement. Nuclear power became cheap and clean and everywhere. The transistor was never miniaturized the way it was in our history. Computers in the Fallout world are enormous, room-filling things, held together with vacuum tubes and magnetic tape. Robots walk upright on their back legs. But the styling of everything is deeply, permanently anchored in the American 1950s, the decade when the world first felt the weight of the atom and decided, collectively, to be optimistic about it. This aesthetic choice has a purpose beyond visual distinctiveness. It is a comment on optimism itself. The Fallout world is populated by people who genuinely, desperately believed in progress, in the idea that technology would solve every problem, that science applied correctly would produce abundance and safety and the good life for everyone. The advertisements were not just cynical marketing. The people who designed the Vault Boy mascot, who wrote the Vault-Tec promotional materials, who produced the cheerful films about the bright atomic future, many of them believed it. The gap between what they believed and what was actually happening is not simply a matter of corporate bad faith. It is also a mirror of the particular human capacity to look at evidence of approaching catastrophe and see in it the reflection of continued comfort. The Chrysalis Corvega, the Pulowski Preservation Shelter, the small prefab pod you find on every street corner, where someone in the last minutes of peace could theoretically seal themselves in and survive. The safe system tests that played on television, showing cheerful families running to their basements in neat drills. The Vault-Tec billboards, a smiling family, the parents in matching blue-yellow jumpsuits, the children waving, the Vault Boy giving his eternal thumbs up against a mushroom cloud so stylized it had become decorative. These are the artifacts of a world that had decided not to look at what it was doing, and built a magnificent aesthetic of cheerfulness as the decision's monument. Under the surface of all that manufactured happiness, the resource wars had been grinding on for decades. Oil was gone, coal was running out. Nations that had once traded and cooperated were now in active competition for the last scraps of fossil fuel, and those tensions had been simmering since the early 2050s. By 2066, war between the United States and China had become a permanent fixture of the world order. Chinese forces invaded Alaska, and the U.S. fought back in a brutal campaign that dragged on for years. The Battle of Anchorage became one of the defining military events of the era. American soldiers pushed across frozen ground in T-51 power armor, while propaganda machines back home spun it all into heroism, into duty, into the kind of clean and glorious narrative that makes young people sign up and old people feel proud. But on the ground, in the mud and the cold, it was just war, the same as it always was. Meanwhile, a company called Vault-Tec was quietly becoming one of the most powerful corporations in American history. Vault-Tec had been awarded a government contract to build fallout shelters across the country, not small ones. Enormous underground complexes capable of housing hundreds of people each, stocked with food and water and medical supplies, equipped with power generators and recirculating air systems. The advertising made them look like paradise-clean white corridors, smiling residents, a cozy subterranean community waiting to carry civilization through whatever darkness the surface world threw at it. The Vault Boy mascot grinned from billboards and pamphlets across the country, a round-faced cartoon fellow in a blue and yellow jumpsuit, giving an enthusiastic thumbs up. He was everywhere. He was the symbol of American preparedness and atomic-age optimism packaged into a simple, friendly image. What the public didn't know was that Vault-Tec had no intention of saving humanity. The vaults were a product. The war was going to happen whether anyone wanted it to or not, and Vault-Tec had built its entire business model around guaranteeing that outcome. Internal documents discovered by players across nearly 30 years of Fallout games reveal that Vault-Tec's senior executives understood long before the bombs fell that their shelters were never designed to open and release healthy populations into a rebuilt world. They were designed as laboratories. Each vault would be sealed with its own hidden set of experimental conditions, its inhabitants completely unaware that they had volunteered themselves and their families as test subjects. The data collected would allow Vault-Tec and its associated interests to design and control whatever society emerged from the ashes. The scale of this betrayal is almost impossible to comprehend. Families lined up to register for vault spots. They sold their homes and packed their belongings. They moved into pre-assigned positions, said goodbye to neighbors who had been assigned to different vaults or no vault at all, and waited. Parents told their children it was going to be all right. And for many of them, in the final hours before the world ended, it must have felt genuinely possible that it might be the 23rd of October 2077. The exact timeline of the Great War has been reconstructed from terminal entries, government records, military communications, and the accounts of the very few people who survived long enough to document what they witnessed. At 9:13 in the morning, the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System picked up the first missile launches. The system couldn't immediately confirm their origin. Within minutes, NORAD had confirmation. The President of the United States issued retaliatory strike orders at 9:26 a.m. under scenario MX CN91, the Mutually Assured Destruction Protocol, the most coldly named set of instructions ever written for the end of the world. By 9:47 a.m., nuclear weapons were falling on the eastern seaboard. 2 hours after the first detection, it was over. The exchange had consumed the entire globe. The question of who fired the first missile has been one of the most hotly debated pieces of Fallout lore for almost 30 years. The original game creators, Tim Kaine in particular, have said in interviews that China fired first, that the Chinese government, aware of American bioweapons research using the forced evolutionary virus, launched a preemptive strike in desperation. That version of events was never formally written into the games as unambiguous canon. The games left it deliberately vague. The more you look, the murkier it gets. There is a Chinese submarine, the Yangtze, sitting on the bottom of Boston Harbor in Fallout 4, its captain who ghoulified and survived the centuries, not even certain whether his country fired first. He followed orders. He launched what he had. He has been sitting with that ever since. Then, the Amazon Prime television series arrived and complicated everything further. In the final episode of the first season, we see a meeting. Pre-war Vault-Tec executives and the heads of the largest corporations in America gathered in a room, discussing how to ensure their investment in the Vault system would pay off. The problem is obvious. If peace negotiations between the US and China succeed, there is no nuclear war, and therefore no market for nuclear shelters. A woman named Barb Howard, wife of the actor who would eventually become the wandering bounty hunter known as the Ghoul, stands up and delivers a suggestion that stops the room cold. She says that Vault-Tec could simply drop the bombs themselves, be the catalyst, guarantee the outcome. Whether that meeting led directly to the Great War, or whether it was simply one piece of a larger, messier picture involving the Enclave and multiple competing agendas all colliding on the same morning in October, is something the storytellers have carefully left unresolved. There is a detail buried in the lore that makes the whole thing even stranger. Vault-Tec's suggestion wasn't even Barb Howard's own idea. She was pressured into delivering it by a representative of the Enclave, a shadowy organization with its own plans for what the post-war world should look like. So if Vault-Tec dropped the first bomb, they may have done it at someone else's urging. And that someone may have had their own puppet master. The chain of culpability in Fallout spirals downward and never quite reaches a bottom. What is clear is the aftermath. Within hours, the surface of most of the continental United States was uninhabitable. The cities that had been the centerpieces of American life, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, were craters and ruins. The suburbs around them burned. The rural areas between them cooked under radiation clouds that drifted on the wind for weeks. Most of the population was dead within the first days, either from the blasts or from the fallout that settled into the soil and water and air. Animals mutated in strange and often terrifying ways. The ecosystem restructured itself around radiation tolerance rather than sunlight and clean water. Rad scorpions grew to the size of cars. Deathclaws emerged from what had been the forced evolution experiments and proved so capable at surviving the New World that nothing else in the food chain quite managed to stop them. The humans who survived fell into several categories. Some had made it to the vaults in time. Others had found shelter by luck, a basement, a refrigerator, a concrete bunker that happened to catch the right angle of shadow from a nearby building. And a third group simply absorbed enough radiation to kill a normal person several times over, and instead underwent the slow, agonizing transformation into something that would come to be called a ghoul. They lost their hair, their skin pulled tight and darkened and cracked. Their appearances became something from an old horror film. Many of them lost their minds. But some retained everything, their memories, their personalities, their ability to love and grieve and make decisions and feel hope. They just looked like monsters. 200 years passed. The survivors' children had children. Communities formed, collapsed, reformed. People scratched out settlements from the ruins and called them home. And somewhere underground, in sealed chambers that had become tombs or laboratories or something in between, the vault dwellers waited, most of them not knowing what was happening on the surface, not knowing how much time had passed, not knowing whether anyone was ever going to come for them. The immediate aftermath of the Great War lasted roughly a decade, a period so brutal and so poorly documented that it exists in the Fallout lore mostly as a gap the silence before the earliest holotape recordings and terminal entries, before the first communities were stable enough to maintain written records. What we know comes from fragments. The caravans that started forming in Central California within the first few years, connecting the scattered populations of survivors, the early settlements that grew up around water sources that hadn't been completely contaminated, Shady Sands, the Hub, a few others, the first Brotherhood of Steel patrols emerging from Lost Hills to assess a world they had watched burn from underground. What historians in the Fallout world there are some, in the NCR and among the followers of the Apocalypse call, the long winter wasn't a single winter, but the years of nuclear winter that followed the initial exchange. Particles of ash and debris in the upper atmosphere reduced solar penetration for years, killing crops that might otherwise have survived the radiation and extending the period of starvation and cold that made every settlement's first decade a near-death experience. The survivors who made it through those years were shaped by that experience in ways that persisted for generations. The scarcity mindset, the mistrust, the tendency to hoard, to fortify, to assume that what you have will be taken if you cannot defend it. The culture that produced the pre-war world, open, mobile, optimistic, willing to extend credit and trust, was not the culture that produced the wasteland's surviving communities. What survived was something older and harder, a social technology built for subsistence rather than abundance. Families and small groups were the organizational unit because anything larger was too difficult to maintain without the infrastructure that no longer existed. The knowledge of how to build that infrastructure was preserved, in fragments, in the vaults, and in the Brotherhood's archives, and in the memories of people who had worked in technical fields before the war. But the gap between knowing how something works and having the materials and population and stability to rebuild it is enormous. And that gap is what the wasteland is. 200 years of people trying to close a distance that keeps being reopened by the next crisis, the next war, the next faction's decision that what everyone else built needed to be cleared away. This is the world of Fallout, and we have barely scratched its surface. Drop me a comment. Where are you watching or listening from right now? What time is it there? And if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you never miss these long, slow journeys through the lore we love. Now, let's go deeper. Section 2. Vault-Tec's Laboratory of Horrors. There were 122 vaults built in total. That number comes from internal Vault-Tec documents that survived the war in various digital archives scattered across the wasteland. Of those 122, only 17 were what Vault-Tec internally called control vaults, shelters that functioned more or less as advertised, without a hidden experimental agenda. Normal food supplies, normal social structures, normal overseers with normal instructions. Those 17 were the minority. The other 105 had something wrong with them, and some of them had something genuinely monstrous. Understanding the Vault experiments requires understanding what Vault-Tec believed it was doing. The official justification, filtered through layers of corporate language, was that the vaults would generate data about human behavior under extreme stress and isolation. That data would then be used to build better, more stable communities after the war. The scientific framework was real. The ethical framework was non-existent. In practice, Vault-Tec sealed people underground with conditions that were designed to produce suffering, conflict, and psychological collapse, and then watched. Let's start with the one that most players encounter first. Vault 101 sits beneath the ruins of a quiet suburb in the capital wasteland, not far from what used to be Washington, D.C. To the people living inside it in the year 2277, it is the entire world. They were born here, they will die here, and the outside does not exist in any practical sense for them. The Overseer enforces this. The Vault's official purpose from Vault-Tec's perspective was never written on a placard or explained in an orientation session. The experiment was this. The Vault's doors were never scheduled to open, not after the all-clear signal, not after a century, not ever. Vault 101 was a test of what happens to a society that has no horizon, a community that has been told, explicitly or through silence, that there is no tomorrow beyond these walls. The secondary experiment was almost more interesting than the first. Vault 101 was testing the role of the Overseer. Specifically, what happens when a leader is given absolute authority with no external accountability and no prospect of the situation ever changing? What kind of person does that authority make them? What kind of rules do they create? What happens when a generation grows up that has never known anything else? Those questions have answers in Vault 101. And most of them are uncomfortable. Vault 106, a short distance away, had a different problem. 10 days after its doors sealed on the 23rd of October 2077, a psychoactive compound began flowing through the air filtration system. The Overseer knew. According to terminal entries that survived the centuries, the Overseer received instructions about this and relayed them to security personnel. Observe the effects, document everything, maintain order as long as possible. What Vault 106 became in the following generations was not a community. It became something fractured and violent, shaped by decade after decade of exposure to a chemical that made the ordinary world feel strange and threatening. The inhabitants that the lone wanderer encounters in Fallout 3 are descendants of those original Vault dwellers, still affected, still dangerous, still haunting the corridors of a place that was designed to break them. Then there is Vault 11, which may be the cruelest experiment in the entire series. Vault 11 is located in the Mojave Wasteland, west of Boulder City, and it is mostly silent when the player arrives in Fallout, New Vegas. The few audio logs and computer entries that remain tell a story that begins with bureaucratic simplicity and ends in something genuinely nightmarish. When Vault 11 sealed, its inhabitants were given a single instruction. Each year, they must democratically elect one person among themselves to sacrifice. If they complied, the vault would continue to function normally: lights, air, food, water. If they refused, everyone would be killed immediately. This was Of course, a lie. The terminal in the final chamber reveals that the sacrifice was never actually required. It was purely psychological. The entire experiment was a test of how long a community could sustain morally catastrophic behavior when it believed there was no alternative. For generations, Vault 11 held its annual elections. They were genuinely democratic. People voted, they campaigned. Power structures formed around the process. A group called the Justice Bloc gained control and used the elections as a mechanism for eliminating enemies and rewarding loyalty. A woman named Catherine Stone was coerced and exploited by members of the bloc who held her election fate over her head. The sacrifices continued. By the time only 5 people remained the last 5 survivors of the original Vault population, those 5 refused. They could not bring themselves to choose one among themselves to die. They waited for the execution they expected. It didn't come. Instead, a computer message appeared, congratulating them for being shining examples of humanity's capacity for moral courage. The experiment was over. The 5 survivors, we can only imagine, didn't feel much like shining examples of anything. 4 of them took their own lives afterward. One survived long enough to record a terminal entry explaining what had happened. That entry is still there, in the depths of Vault 11, waiting for anyone who explores far enough to find it. Vault 21 in New Vegas was built on a strange premise. All disputes among Vault dwellers, including the selection of the Overseer, had to be resolved through gambling. Want something? Bet for it. Someone wants what you have? You have to wager. It sounds almost playful until you think about it seriously. This is a society where a bad night at the card table could cost you your home, your possessions, or your position in the community hierarchy. Remarkably, it functioned. The Vault ran peacefully for generations, the gambling mechanic keeping conflict formalized and therefore somewhat contained. It ran until Mr. House discovered it, challenged the Overseer to Freckjack game for control of the Vault. 1. Stripped the Vault of its most useful technology and filled most of it with concrete. The top floor was spared at the request of a woman named Sarah Weintraub, who turned it into a hotel. Vault 34, also in the Mojave, was stocked with enough weapons to arm a small army, but provided no authority structure to manage them. No security protocols, no checks on access to the armory, no overseers with the standing to restrict anyone from taking what they wanted. The experiment was obvious in retrospect. What happens when a confined community has access to overwhelming firepower, but no framework for controlling who uses it and when? The Vault became an armed pressure cooker. The population destroyed itself in factional violence. By the time players find it in Fallout, New Vegas, the place is flooded with irradiated water, overrun with ghouls, and the only things still functional are the weapons lockers, which are, naturally, still fully stocked. Vault 77 never appeared directly in a Fallout game, but it achieved a kind of legendary status through a promotional comic created in collaboration with the webcomic Penny Arcade before the release of Fallout 3. The Vault contained exactly 1 man and a crate of puppets. The comic depicts his increasingly elaborate puppet-based fantasies and deteriorating mental state, ending with him venturing into the wasteland where he apparently became a nearly mythological figure who terrorized slavers. There's a reference to him in Fallout 3 itself, a Vault 77 jumpsuit in the Paradise Falls slaver camp, accompanied by a holotape warning the slavers to burn the suit before the puppet man comes to reclaim it. Vault 81, tucked in the hills west of Diamond City in the Commonwealth, was designed to test experimental medical treatments. The idea was to use the sealed Vault population as a test group for cures and treatments without their consent. The Vault's automated systems began pumping experimental compounds into the residents except the scientist in charge, Dr. Olivet, sabotaged the system. She redirected all the experimental treatments to the Vault's resident mole rats instead of the people, horrified by what she had been asked to do. The inhabitants survived, mostly healthy, for 200 years, never knowing what had almost been done to them. What Vault 81 contains when the player finds it in Fallout 4 is a functioning, surprisingly warm community, the most successful Vault in the Commonwealth by almost any measure. It survived because someone with a conscience quietly refused to follow orders in the middle of the night. Vault 92 was an experiment built for musicians. It housed an entire orchestra and the facilities to support them. On the surface, this sounds almost kind of Vault for artists. A place where the survivors of the apocalypse would be people who dedicated their lives to beauty. The reality was that the vault's white noise generators had been embedded with subliminal psychotic triggers, designed to test the effects of audio-induced psychological manipulation on an enclosed population. The musicians, exposed night after night to the hidden frequencies in their sleep systems, became increasingly violent. The vault ended in a massacre. When players find it in Fallout 3, the skeletons are still there, in postures that suggest the killings were sudden and confused. Some of them died holding their instruments. Vault 101's never open the door policy was deliberate. Vault 112's approach was more elaborate, and perhaps more terrifying in a quiet, slow-burning way. All residents of Vault 112 were placed in suspended animation and connected to a virtual reality simulator called Tranquility Lane, designed to replicate an idyllic pre-war American suburb. The residents were told the simulation would be a pleasant escape while the surface recovered. What they weren't told is that their overseer, a man named Dr. Stanislaus Braun, had been given full administrative access to the simulation and had decided, with the particular brand of godlike cruelty that absolute power tends to produce, to use it as his personal torture device. Braun spent over 200 years inflicting creative suffering on the people in his care. He could rewrite their memories, so they woke with fresh personalities that had no knowledge of what he had already done to them. He made them hurt each other, turn on each other, watch each other die. He could reset everything and start again. By the time the lone wanderer enters the Tranquility Lane simulation in Fallout 3, searching for their father James, the simulation depicts a perfect 1950s neighborhood where every resident is visibly, quietly, deeply wrong, too cheerful, unnervingly compliant. Braun himself, physically an elderly man with a frail body and a child's toy in his hand, greets the player with the demeanor of someone who has forgotten that anything outside the simulation is real. There was no heroic ending to his story. Braun is still there, still in the pod, still connected. Vault 87, deep in the mountains northwest of the capital Wasteland, received its vault dwellers and immediately began pumping them full of the forced evolutionary virus. Not in small doses as part of a study in massive, fatal doses intended to produce super mutants. The vaults were supposed to produce data on human survival. Vault 87 was producing an army. The super mutants that roam the capital Wasteland in Fallout 3, enormous and violent and largely incapable of complex thought, are the descendants of the people who sealed themselves in Vault 87 on October 23, 2077, believing they were going to be safe. Vault 108 is the Gary Vault, and it deserves its reputation. The vault began with a reasonable enough social structure, but the systems were deliberately undermined from the start. The overseer was terminally ill. The security detail was inadequate. The entertainment options were stripped to minimum. The armory was overstocked. All of these factors were designed by Vault-Tec to produce chaos, but Vault 108 didn't collapse into chaos. Its residents adapted and survived. They even made scientific progress, developing a cloning program. One dweller, a man named Gary, volunteered for the program. He was cloned 54 times, each successive clone slightly more aggressive and cognitively limited than the last, until the Garys, as a collective entity, took over the vault. When the lone wanderer enters Vault 108 in Fallout 3, every room is occupied by a Gary clone. There is no dialogue with them, there is no negotiation. There is only the muffled, echoing sound of their voices bellowing a single word over and over into the dark corridors. Gary. Vault 75, hidden beneath a school in the Commonwealth, welcomed families with children and then separated them immediately upon entry. The parents were told the children needed a separate orientation. The parents were killed. The children were raised in a rigorous program of physical and psychological conditioning designed to produce enhanced super soldiers, humans with artificially boosted stats. Raised from infancy in controlled competitive environments, the weakest regularly culled. The Vault's terminals in Fallout 4 document this in the detached, clinical language of someone filling out a performance review. Objectives, metrics, outcomes. The children who survived the program were eventually sent to the surface as assets for Vault-Tec's post-war plans. What became of them is left to the imagination. Vault 29 was built in Colorado and populated entirely with children under the age of 15. Their parents were assigned to other vaults or turned away entirely. ZAX. The Vault's supercomputer AI raised the children according to principles derived from the overseer's particular ideological vision. The Vault experimented with whether children, separated from adult influence and raised from early childhood by an artificial intelligence, would build a more harmonious society. Whether they did is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the society they built had some very specific and deeply ingrained values by the time anyone from outside arrived to find them. Vault 29 is connected to one of the more quietly devastating experiments in Fallout lore, the deliberate and permanent fracturing of families on the day the world ended. Parents placed their children in the Vault line and were told they would follow. They never did. The children grew up in ZAX's care, never knowing their parents weren't coming. For the parents sent to different vaults or left to die on the surface, the last thing they ever did was trust a corporation with their child's life. Vault 19 divided its inhabitants into two color-coded factions, red and blue, and then subjected them to years of subliminal messaging, strange noises, unexplained lights, and whispered voices designed to amplify paranoia and mistrust between the two groups. It was a laboratory recreation of political polarization, a test of how long a community could hold together when its members were being quietly, consistently told that the people around them were the enemy. The Vault barely held together at all. The sulfur fumes leaking in from a nearby mine didn't help. By the time anyone found Vault 19 in New Vegas, most of its population had long since abandoned it, carrying their paranoia with them into the wasteland and eventually forming a raider gang. Vault 55 had all of its entertainment, every tape, every book, every game, every musical instrument removed before sealing. The experiment was studying whether the absence of entertainment would produce psychological collapse or creative adaptation. Would people invent new forms of culture? Or would the silence drive them apart? Adjacent to it, Vault 56 had the same conditions, but with one exception: a single clown entertainer programmed to perform the same routine indefinitely. Vault-Tec researchers considered Vault 55 and 56 companion experiments designed to run in parallel and generate comparative data. The data they generated was apparently not what anyone had hoped for. Vault 43 was stocked with 20 men, 10 women, and 1 panther. Nobody has ever fully explained the panther. Vault 44 was designed with only women. Vault 37 was for Black residents only. Vault 29 was for children only. The demographic segregation experiments raise questions that the Fallout games rarely spell out explicitly but leave hanging in every room of every vault like a bad smell. What, exactly, was Vault-Tec imagining when it built a post-war society around these categories? What future was the corporation designing for? The answer, pieced together from fragments, is one that involved Vault-Tec and a handful of corporate allies owning and operating that future entirely, using the vaults as manufacturing facilities for pre-selected population types that would fill pre-planned social roles. Vault 31, 32, and 33 from the Amazon Prime television series form the most elaborate vault experiment yet depicted. Vault 31 was not inhabited by regular families, but by cryogenically preserved Vault-Tec employees, specifically mid-level managers hand-selected for their obedience, loyalty, and willingness to follow company directives without ethical interference. Vaults 32 and 33 were populated with normal people, but their overseers were drawn from the sleepers in Vault 31 on a rotating schedule. The entire system was designed to produce a succession of perfectly compliant leaders for the communities, ensuring that whenever the vaults eventually opened, the society that emerged would already have Vault-Tec loyalists in positions of authority. The oversight chain would remain intact. The experiment would continue on the surface. It nearly worked. The overseer of Vault 33 in the television series, a man named Hank McLean, was one of those sleepers from Vault 31. He had a family in the vault, a wife and children who believed he was one of them. He maintained that cover for decades. He made real connections. He may have genuinely loved his family. And then his wife, growing uncomfortable with the vault's direction, threatened to expose what she knew about the vault system's true nature. Hank, the loyal Vault-Tec man he was trained to be, could not allow that. He called a strike from the surface. The bombs that fell on Shady Sands, the capital of the new California Republic, one of the most promising post-war societies in the history of the wasteland, were called by a man sitting in the safety of his vault, protecting a corporation's legacy. The vault experiments did not end in 2077. They continued for 200 years, shaping the wasteland from the inside out. Section 3. The Ghoul Chronicles. Ghouls are everywhere in the wasteland. You learn to see past them quickly when you're trying to survive. They register as a threat or a non-threat, as something to talk to or something to shoot, and then you move on. But slow down long enough to think about what a ghoul actually is, and the picture that emerges is one of the most quietly haunting in all of Fallout. A ghoul was a person, not was in the distant past sense, not in the way that a skeleton used to be a person. Ghouls who retain their minds, the ones who haven't gone feral, are still the people they were before the bombs fell. They remember the world that existed. They remember families and jobs and houses and the smell of clean air. They have lived through everything, watched everyone they knew die of age or violence while they kept going, and they do it without the consolation of forgetting. The radiation that mutated their bodies and gave them near immortality did not grant them peace. It just kept them alive. The first ghouls appeared in the immediate aftermath of the Great War. The radiation that flooded the surface was unlike anything the human body had encountered before, and for most people who received high doses, it was simply fatal. But in some cases, for reasons that even the Fallout lore doesn't fully explain, partly because the game creators themselves never fully settled on a single canonical answer, some people transformed instead. Their hair fell out. Their skin cracked and thickened and darkened. Their internal organs restructured themselves around the new biological reality of constant radiation exposure. The transformation was not gentle. It took months or years, and most who underwent it probably wish they hadn't survived long enough to complete it. Ghoulification seems to correlate with the amount of radiation received, but it isn't purely a function of dosage. People standing next to each other under the same fallout cloud could have entirely different outcomes. One dies in days, one becomes a ghoul. One seems relatively unaffected. The variables are not well understood by anyone in the wasteland, and that unpredictability is part of what makes ghouls socially complicated. There is no reliable way to predict who will become one, which means there is no reliable way to feel superior to them. The early ghoul communities formed out of necessity. Non-feral ghouls who could think and communicate were still deeply unwelcome in most human settlements. Their appearance triggered fear and revulsion. And in a world already running on scarcity and violence, fear tends to express itself quickly and badly. So, ghouls clustered together. They built their own communities in places humans were unlikely to want, deeper in radiation zones, in the ruins of cities that were too hot for most people to enter comfortably. One of the oldest of these communities was Necropolis, built over the ruins of Bakersfield, California, in the earliest years after the war. The ghouls who founded it had come from Vault-12, the vault whose door had been designed by Vault-Tec not to close. The experiment was studying the effects of radiation on a sealed vault population, which in practice meant the experiment was, what happens if we give people a vault that doesn't actually protect them? The answer was ghoulification for the survivors. They emerged from the vault transformed, built a city in the ruins above it, and for generations maintained a community that, while strange and dark and internally fractious, was theirs. Necropolis appears in the original Fallout game, set in the year 2161, about 84 years after the war. By then, the city's governance had passed through several hands and ended up in the possession of a ghoul named Set, whose approach to leadership was aggressively hostile and deeply suspicious of outsiders. The vault dweller who arrives seeking a replacement water chip is not warmly received, but the city is alive. There are hundreds of ghouls there, going about their days, maintaining the ghost of a civilization in the ruins of one that burned. Between the first and second Fallout games, Necropolis fell. The Master's army, the super mutant force working to transform humanity en masse, swept through the city and killed most of its inhabitants. The ghouls who survived scattered north, eventually settling around an old nuclear power plant in the Central Valley. This new settlement became Gecko, a rough and functional community that makes its living operating the aging plant and trading with nearby human towns. It survives. In a wasteland full of communities that collapse, Gecko survives. There is a remarkable character who ends up there, and his story deserves time. His name is Harold, and he is the closest thing Fallout has to a through-line character who connects the earliest history of the wasteland to its most recent chapters. Harold was born in 2072, 5 years before the Great War. He survived in a vault, emerged into the wasteland, and became a caravan trader in the years when the hub, one of the first major human settlements in the ruins of California, was just starting to take shape. He was good at his work. He knew people. He was, by the accounts preserved in his many dialogue conversations across 3 games, a genuinely decent man. In 2102, Harold joined a small expedition to investigate reports of strange activity at the Mariposa military base. The base had been the site of advanced FEV experiments before the war, and whatever remained inside was drawing attention. The expedition went wrong. The base was still defended by automated systems that killed most of the explorers. By the end, only Harold and a man named Richard Gray remained. They made it deep into the base, to the chamber where the FEV vats were. A robotic crane malfunctioned and knocked Gray directly into one of the vats. Harold was struck by something and knocked unconscious, waking later in the desert with the early signs of FEV mutation beginning to affect his body. Gray, submerged in the FEV, didn't die. He mutated. He became something without precedent. A creature that was expanding and consuming and building, growing tendrils that absorbed other organisms and integrated their biological material and cognitive function. He developed psychic abilities. He began calling himself the Master. Harold woke up in the wasteland, was found by traders 4 days later, and began the long and painful process of becoming something the world didn't have a word for. His appearance shifted toward what most people would recognize as a ghoul-cracked skin, sunken features, the look of something that should have died but hadn't. He lost his business. People he had worked with for years couldn't look at him. He lost the life he had built, and then something grew out of his head. A small plant, at first. Just a sprout. Harold named it Bob, because Harold was that kind of person, the kind who names the thing growing out of his skull rather than despairing about it. Bob grew slowly over the years, becoming a small tree, a companion, an entity that Harold talked to and complained about and, in a way that neither of them could fully articulate, seemed to share some kind of awareness with. Harold spent decades wandering. He passed through Texas, through Los Angeles, through dozens of wastelands communities, contributing what he could, moving on when he had to. By 2238, he arrived in Gecko and stayed for years, helping the ghoul community manage their power plant, serving as a de facto mayor, keeping the peace between Gecko and the deeply hostile Vault City nearby. He was good at it. He had, in the century and a half since Mariposa, developed the particular patient wisdom of someone who has outlived everyone they ever knew and had to decide, over and over again, whether to keep going. He kept going. Eventually, Bob grew large enough to root Harold to the ground. He could no longer travel. He ended up, through circumstances that are more gradual than dramatic, in the capital wasteland, the ruins of Washington, D.C., where Bob had grown into a full tree and Harold had become part of it. A small community called the Tree Minders had grown up around him, worshipping Harold as a nature god, the living embodiment of renewal in a dead world. Harold found this profoundly uncomfortable. He had spent his life as a regular person who had unusual things happen to him, and being worshipped was not something he had wanted. By the time the lone wanderer encounters Harold in Fallout 3, he has been rooted to his spot in Oasis, a hidden, radiation-free grove that Bob's presence has somehow created for about 20 years. He can talk, he can think, he can remember everything, and what he wants more than anything is for the lone wanderer to help him die. The Tree Minders have split over what to do. One faction wants Harold to spread further, sending Bob's seeds outward to restore plant life across the wasteland, a genuine terraforming mission that would take generations. Another wants to contain him, keep Oasis isolated and safe, let what has been preserved here survive rather than risking it by expansion. And Harold himself sits in the middle of this argument, having become the unwilling nexus of a philosophical dispute he never asked to be part of, and wondering if anyone will simply respect his request to be allowed to stop. What you decide to do when you find him is entirely up to you. The saddest truth about ghouls is the one that almost nobody in the wasteland wants to engage with directly. The difference between a non-feral ghoul and a feral one is not a matter of character or moral worth. It's biology. A non-feral ghoul who is exposed to sufficient ongoing radiation or who goes long enough without the right chemical intervention will eventually lose the cognitive capacity that makes them recognizably themselves. The memories remain, but the ability to access and use them fades. What's left is a creature operating on instinct and pain, howling through the corridors of a supermarket or a hospital or a metro station, forever in the last few square blocks of a life they can no longer remember having. There is a type of ghoul called a glowing one that accumulated so much radiation that it became luminescent. Glowing ones emit radiation passively and can irradiate everything around them. Some of them retain their intelligence. Some of them develop a kind of spiritual authority within ghoul communities revered, kept at distance, treated as something sacred or terrible, or both at once. The Bright Brotherhood in New Vegas was built around the leadership of a glowing one named Jason Bright, who had a vision of a promised land beyond the radiation and led his congregation toward rockets he believed would take them there. Whether what he was reaching for was real or metaphorical, or simply a beautiful story that kept a community from falling into despair, is one of those questions Fallout allows you to sit with rather than answering. Ghouls cannot have children. Radiation sterilizes them. New ghouls come only from humans who undergo ghoulification, which means that, in theory, as the world becomes less radioactive over time, the ghoul population will slowly decline. They cannot replenish themselves. What exists now is what there is, aging in their own strange way, carrying the memories of a world that no one else can remember anymore. In Fallout 3, there is a place called Underworld, built in the ruins of the Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. It is a ghoul settlement in the most literal sense, a community of non-feral ghouls living inside a museum, surrounded by the preserved remnants of a civilization they predate. The dinosaur skeletons and the ancient human displays are still there, faded labels still visible, and the ghouls live among them in a kind of accidental poetry. Old beings in a museum of old things, maintaining their social fabric in a building dedicated to the study of time. Underworld has a bar, a hotel, a clinic, a merchant quarter. It is a functioning community with the full range of social dynamics that implies tensions, alliances, personalities in conflict, old grudges, new ones. The ghouls who live there are not defined by their ghoulhood in their own estimation. They are defined by who they are as individuals, as they always were, but the world insists on categorizing them by their appearance first. There is a ghoul named Roy Phillips who spent years planning to take over a human settlement, Tenpenny Tower, the luxury residential building where wealthy survivors have maintained something like a pre-war lifestyle, kept carefully segregated from the people living in the wasteland outside. Phillips wants in. He is not unreasonable in his grievance. Tenpenny Tower is a fortified haven that has maintained comfortable living conditions precisely because it has kept out everyone who wasn't already wealthy or connected, which, in the post-war context, means it has maintained comfortable conditions for a small group of people by refusing to share those conditions with everyone who needed them. Phillips's plan, in the version of the story where the player negotiates a peaceful solution, ends with ghouls and humans living together in Tenpenny Tower. The experiment in cohabitation, documented in later terminal entries, lasts a few months before it fails catastrophically, not because cohabitation is impossible in principle, but because this particular group, in this particular compressed space, could not navigate the specific interpersonal dynamics fast enough to prevent the collapse. The failure of the Tenpenny Tower experiment is one of Fallout 3's most pointedly cynical observations, and it lands differently depending on how much optimism you brought to the negotiated solution. It is not saying that integration is impossible. It is saying that it requires more than proximity and a declaration of policy. It requires the slower, harder work of actually learning to live with people who are different from you in ways that make you uncomfortable, and that work cannot be rushed and cannot be delegated. That John Hancock, the mayor of Good Neighbor in Fallout 4, was a man who chose ghoulification as one of the most unusual details in the series. He had been a human politician running one of the few functioning semi-democratic city-states in the Commonwealth. He injected himself with a cocktail of chems that triggered ghoulification deliberately, because he felt that as a human he was too insulated from the suffering that defined life in the wasteland for most people. He wanted to know what it felt like. He wanted to be changed by it rather than just observing it from a position of comfort. He survived the transformation. He came out the other side with his mind intact and his personality largely unchanged, still the same thoughtful, darkly humorous, deeply principled person he had been before, just wearing a different face. He went back to running Good Neighbor. He kept doing the work. Section 4. The Brotherhood of Steel: A Night's Vigil. On October 20th, 2077, 3 days before the bombs fell, a captain in the United States Army named Roger Maxson made a decision that would shape the next several centuries of history on the American continent. Maxson was stationed at the Mariposa military base in California, the same facility where the FEV experiments had been taking place and where, 6 years earlier, Harold and Richard Gray had conducted their ill-fated expedition. Maxson's team had been sent to oversee the research, which they had been told was a standard national security program. What they found when they arrived and gained access to the base's classified areas was not standard. The scientists at Mariposa were conducting experiments on human subjects, civilians, prisoners, whoever had ended up in their documentation as available test material, dosing them with FEV, and cataloging the results. The experiments were not quick. They were not humane. Maxson, described by those who knew him as a man of genuine ethical seriousness underneath his military professionalism, was horrified. He questioned the base's commanding officer, Colonel Robert Spindle, and received evasive answers and bureaucratic deflection. He questioned the scientists and received the same. He established that what was happening at Mariposa was government-ordered. The order had come from above Spindle, above the base chain of command, from somewhere deeper in the apparatus of a government that was already rotting with the weight of a war it was losing, and the moral compromises that had accumulated like sediment over years. Maxson ordered the scientists executed. He then declared himself and his entire unit in a state of desertion from the United States military. 3 days later, the bombs fell. Maxson had managed to move his unit soldiers and their families out of Mariposa before the attack. They traveled south to the Lost Hills Bunker, a military installation that had been built as a backup command facility and was now, with the rest of the government vaporized, simply available. They sealed themselves inside and began the long, difficult process of figuring out what they were. What Maxson built in those first years was remarkable and strange. He was trained in sociology and psychology, something of a rarity for a military officer, and he applied those skills to the problem of creating a new society from scratch with the limited and traumatized human material he had available. He drafted organizational principles. He created ranks and rituals. He wrote documents that would form the ideological foundation of everything that came after. He called the organization the Brotherhood of Steel, invoking the bonds between soldiers and the preservation of human knowledge and craft. The Brotherhood's founding vision, in Maxson's conception, was not one of isolation or superiority. He wanted the Brotherhood to work with the survivors, to help rebuild, to serve as a protective and preservationist force that would keep the most important technological and intellectual knowledge from being lost during the centuries of disorder that followed the war. He believed the Brotherhood should recruit from outside its own walls, should interact with the wasteland communities that were beginning to form, should see itself as part of a larger human story rather than a separate and superior one. He was in the minority on this. Many of his soldiers, shaped by military culture that had always emphasized hierarchy and exclusion, found the idea of opening their doors uncomfortable. The technology in the Lost Hills bunker was extraordinary power armor, energy weapons, sophisticated medical and scientific equipment, and sharing it felt dangerous, even irresponsible. In a world where every resource was contested, Maxson never fully convinced them. He kept trying until he died of cancer in 2135, at the age of roughly 89, having spent 6 decades trying to hold the Brotherhood to a mission it kept quietly rejecting. His son, Maxson II, took over immediately and formalized what had already been the de facto practice. The Brotherhood closed itself. No more outside recruitment. No more interaction with wasteland communities except on the Brotherhood's own terms. The technology stayed locked inside Lost Hills, and the idea that it belonged to all of humanity quietly died. By the time of the original Fallout game, set in 2161, the Brotherhood is a formidable military power in the ruins of California. But it is also deeply insular and increasingly strange. The High Elder is Roger Maxson's grandson, John Maxson, who everyone describes as a capable man but an uncomfortable politician, a soldier who inherited a bureaucracy. The Brotherhood scavenges technology, catalogs it, hoards it. They fight when they have to. They keep to themselves when they can. They are also the only organization in California with enough firepower to stop the Master's army. That conflict, the battle that ends the original Fallout game, in which the Vault Dweller must somehow persuade the Brotherhood to commit its forces to a direct assault on the Master's stronghold, is the first great test of whether the Brotherhood's isolated existence has made them better or worse at being what they claim to be. The answer is complicated. They fight, they win, then they go back to their bunker and continue being exactly who they were. Two things about the Brotherhood's history deserve particular attention because they represent the two faces of the organization, its best impulse and its worst. The best impulse is represented by Owen Lyons. In the mid-22 ND century, the Brotherhood sent an expedition east into the ruins of Washington, D.C. They were looking for technology, specifically any advanced scientific equipment that had survived in the government buildings and research facilities of the old capital. Elder Owen Lyons led this expedition, which traveled across the continent, cataloged what it found in the ruins of Pittsburgh along the way, and eventually established a base of operations in what had been the Pentagon, now called the Citadel. Lyons was given a promotion and a mandate to continue the mission. What he found in D.C. changed him. The capital wasteland was in a desperate state. The super mutant presence centered on the Vault-87 operation, which was still processing human beings into new soldiers after 2 centuries, had made the region almost ungovernable. Ghouls, raiders, and irradiated monsters made travel between settlements nearly impossible. The regular people trying to survive in the ruins of the greatest city on Earth were doing so with almost no support, no infrastructure, and no protection from anything larger than their own immediate neighbors. Lyons started protecting them. He redirected the Brotherhood's efforts away from pure technology acquisition and toward active engagement with the wasteland's problems. His paladins patrolled the roads between settlements. His scribes shared medical knowledge. His resources went to building something that resembled defense rather than hoarding. The Lost Hills Elder Council was not pleased. They cut Lyons off communications, supply lines, formal recognition. As far as the West Coast Brotherhood was concerned, what Lyons was doing in D.C. was a betrayal of the organization's purpose, a wasteful dilution of resources on people who were not, in any organizational sense, the Brotherhood's concern. Lyons's chapter became an unofficial entity, supported by its own captured technology and populated by its own recruits, cut off from the larger structure. They kept going anyway. Lyons died in 2278. His daughter Sarah, who had grown up in the Brotherhood and become one of its finest combat operatives, led the chapter through a brief and turbulent period, and then died in battle. The chapter struggled through a leadership vacuum for years, until a teenager named Arthur Maxon, the last living direct descendant of Roger Maxon, was appointed elder at the age of 16. Arthur Maxon was everything the Brotherhood had always said it valued: physically formidable, intellectually serious, respectful of tradition, utterly decisive. He had been sent to D.C. as a young child to be raised by Owen Lyons because the Western Brotherhood's internal politics had made his safety uncertain. He grew up in the Citadel, trained by the best soldiers the chapter had, and developed a reputation in his teens for single-handedly resolving conflicts, killing a super mutant leader at 14, brokering peace between Lyons's chapter and a splinter group called the Outcasts. When he was given command, he restored ties with the West Coast, rebuilt the chapter's strength, and redirected it back toward the original technological acquisition mission while maintaining Lyons's community engagement in a reduced form. He also commissioned the construction of an enormous airship called the Prydwen. The Prydwen took 6 years to build, assembled piece by piece from scavenged parts, an engineering achievement that probably shouldn't have been possible given the Brotherhood's resources. When it finally launched, it was the most impressive piece of machinery operating above the wasteland, a massive flying carrier that could sustain a full military force, carrying Arthur Maxon and his forces to the Commonwealth in Fallout 4. With the particular grandeur of an organization that wants everyone to understand exactly how serious it is. In the Commonwealth, the Brotherhood's greatest enemy is the Institute, a mysterious scientific organization operating in secret beneath the ruins of Boston, building synthetic humans and pursuing an agenda that most of the surface world doesn't understand. Maxon views the Institute with the particular cold clarity of someone who has already watched FEV tear through a population and sees the same catastrophic potential in synthetic life. He wants it destroyed. Whether he of pride is the question that Fallout 4 puts to the player with great seriousness and no clean answer. There is a third face of the Brotherhood worth considering, and it comes from Fallout 76's Appalachia chapter, the one led by Elizabeth Taggarty, Maxon's old friend from the Resource Wars. Taggarty received Maxon's broadcasts from Lost Hills in the months after the war and built her own chapter from what she had available. A unit of Army Rangers who had survived the war intact, positioned in the Appalachian Mountains, far enough from the blast centers to maintain function. She was a different kind of leader from Maxon. Harder in some ways, more pragmatic, less philosophical. She took the Brotherhood's principles and applied them with military directness. Collect technology, protect knowledge, maintain order. The Appalachian chapter built bases, recruited from local survivor populations, and functioned well for years. Then the Scorch Beasts emerged. The Appalachian Brotherhood's final years were spent fighting an enemy that had no political position, no ideology, no territory to negotiate over, just an extinction-level biological threat spreading through the region and consuming everyone in its path. The chapter dedicated everything it had to the fight. They developed weapons, they established protocols, they built bunkers and trained soldiers and filed reports, and did everything that a military organization is supposed to do when faced with a threat of this magnitude. And they were losing. The Scorched Plague moved faster than their countermeasures. Their population declined. The chapters that had been sending supplies from the West Coast were no longer in contact. The chapter was alone in the Appalachian Mountains, fighting something that could not be reasoned with, running out of people and options in roughly equal measure. Elder Maxon, Roger Maxon, by then dead for decades, this being a different Maxon in the succession, had proposed using a nuclear weapon to irradiate the entire region and potentially stop the plague at its source. Taggarty refused. The founding principle against using nuclear weapons was absolute for her, not because she had inherited it uncritically, but because she had looked at the world around her and concluded that this particular principle, this particular line, was the one that separated the Brotherhood from the thing it was supposed to prevent. An organization built on the premise that the pre-war world's careless relationship with destructive technology had caused the catastrophe could not respond to the catastrophe with more of the same technology without becoming something it had explicitly defined itself against. She died holding that line. The Brotherhood's story, from Roger Maxon's mutiny in 2077 to Arthur Maxon's airborne campaign in 2287, is a story about the gap between an organization's founding principles and its actual behavior, a gap that gets wider with each generation as the original context disappears and the institution inherits only the forms rather than the spirit of what its founder intended. Roger Maxon wanted to preserve human knowledge for humanity. 200 years later, his descendants are doing something that looks like preservation but feels more like control. The difference between those two things is one that every generation in the wasteland has to work out for itself. Section 5. MR. House and the Kingdom of Neon Light. Robert Edwin House was born to money, lost it, made so much more of it that the original amount became irrelevant, and then spent the years between his 40th birthday and the end of the world building a defense system for Las Vegas, while the rest of the world was running out of oil. Before getting into what he built in the wasteland, it's worth spending some time with what he was before the bombs fell, because House is one of the few Fallout characters with a fully documented pre-war life. He was the founder of Robco Industries, one of the most successful technology companies in pre-war America, responsible for the RoboBrains, the Protectron robot lines, the Pip-Boy personal information processors that Vault-Tec's residents wore on their wrists, and a dozen other products that became foundational to how both the pre-war world and the post-war wasteland functioned. He was a genuine genius, the kind who understood not just his own field, but the interconnections between fields, and he had the combination of charisma and ruthlessness that turns that understanding into empire. He was also, even before the bombs, deeply aware of his own mortality in a way that most people are not. He had calculated, based on his personal medical data, that he was likely to die of a degenerative disease in his 50s. This was unacceptable to him. Not in a fearful way, he was not afraid of death in the conventional sense, but in the pragmatic sense of someone who has significant work to do and insufficient time in which to do it. He began researching life extension, eventually developing a sophisticated system that would allow him to survive in a medically supported stasis pod while his body's disease progression was slowed to almost nothing. The pod kept him in a kind of suspended partial consciousness, Not quite asleep, not quite awake, aware enough to process information but not to act directly in the world. He also built the Lucky 38. The Lucky 38 casino on the Las Vegas Strip is the most recognizable building in the Mojave Wasteland, a pre-war tower of chrome and glass that stands over everything else, its neon sign still running on pre-war power 200 years after the world ended. It was always House's headquarters, always the physical embodiment of his ambition. Before the war, it was a working casino. By the time of Fallout, New Vegas, it is something between a fortress, a museum, and the body of a man who has grown so large that his physical form is just one part of him. Before the war, House calculated, with a probability that he expressed to several people in his characteristic tone of mild superiority, that nuclear exchange was coming within a matter of years. He spent the years before the war building a missile defense system for the Las Vegas region, installing a network of defense platforms in the mountains around the city that he intended to use to intercept incoming warheads. He got very close to completing it. He was still running the final preparations when the 23rd of October 2077 arrived, and his systems, not quite ready, managed to intercept most of the warheads aimed at Las Vegas. Not all of them. 68 nuclear warheads reached their targets in the region. House's defense network stopped the 77th, the one directly aimed at downtown Las Vegas. The city survived. It was damaged, emptied, stripped by whoever came through in the immediate aftermath, occupied by raider tribes and scavengers for decades. But the building stood. The neon held. The Lucky 38 kept running on pre-war power because House, still in his pod and still monitoring, kept it running. He woke up, regained sufficient consciousness to begin acting directly in the world in 2138, more than 60 years after the war. He spent the next century and a half watching, monitoring, planning. He had his Securitrons, a network of robot security units, man-sized and armed, controlled through his mainframe but not nearly enough of them to move openly in the wasteland. He needed a particular piece of pre-war hardware called the Platinum Chip, a final upgrade for the Lucky 38 systems that had been in transit when the bombs fell and had been missing in the desert for 200 years. When NCR scouts began appearing near Hoover Dam in 2274, House decided it was time to emerge. He activated the Securitrons and began offering the raider tribes occupying the strip a choice: work for him, leave, or be destroyed. 3 tribes chose to work for him. They became the chairman-suited, slicked-back 1950s showman running the Tops Casino, the Omerta sinister and heavy and running the Gomorrah, and the White Glove Society refined, eccentric, and managing the Ultralux with a culinary reputation that the player quickly discovers has a dark explanation. House rebuilt the strip, he opened the casinos, he installed a monorail connecting the strip to Freeside. He negotiated a treaty with the NCR that gave them access to Hoover Dam and McCarran Airport in exchange for recognizing his sovereignty over New Vegas. He was 59 years old when the bombs fell. He was in his mid-200s by 2281. Still technically alive in a technological sense, his body sustained by the pod systems, his mind operating through the Lucky 38's mainframe and the Securitrons that served as his extended nervous system. His face appeared on a giant screen in the penthouse. His voice was smooth, considered, and carried the particular condescension of someone who is absolutely certain they are the most intelligent person in any conversation they will ever have. House's vision for the future of humanity is one of the most internally coherent arguments in Fallout's complicated political landscape. He wants to use the economic engine of New Vegas, drawing NCR citizens in as customers, extracting their money, reinvesting it in technology development to reignite the innovation cycle that the Great War interrupted. He has timelines. He can tell you that with 20 years of proper investment, he can restart advanced high-technology development. 50 years. Significant scientific capacity restored. 100 years. Space travel. He wants to put humanity in orbit and then among the stars, carrying the species beyond the radiation-soaked cradle of Earth before the long-term consequences of 200 years of nuclear contamination finish what the bombs started. He genuinely believes this is possible. He may be right. He is also ruthless in ways that people who are focused on the elegance of his plan tend to underestimate. His treatment of the Brotherhood of Steel in New Vegas demonstrates this clearly. When the Courier sides with House, One of the requirements is the destruction of the Mojave Brotherhood chapter, an aging, isolated group barely holding together in a bunker in Hidden Valley, posing no realistic immediate threat to anyone. House won't tolerate them. He calls them terrorists and techno-fetishists and ideologically intractable, and he is not wrong about the Brotherhood's tendency toward dangerous hoarding behavior. But he also isn't willing to negotiate, isn't willing to offer them a role in his vision, isn't willing to consider whether their institutional knowledge might be more valuable alive than eliminated. He just wants them gone. There is no peaceful option. The other great powers in New Vegas are built differently and believe different things, and the courier must eventually choose between them. Caesar's Legion is the most jarring faction in all of Fallout, not because it is evil. The wasteland has no shortage of evil, but because it is coherent. Its founder, a man who calls himself Caesar, was born Edward Sallow in the wasteland, the son of followers of the Apocalypse missionaries. He was captured as a young man by a tribal group and spent years among them, and somewhere in that experience began reading classical history he had salvaged from ruins. He became, in the most genuine sense available to him, a classical scholar. He read about Rome. He understood Rome. He understood why Rome worked and how it had collapsed and what it had achieved in the centuries it functioned, and he decided that this model was what the wasteland needed. He built his legion by conquest, subjugating tribe after tribe, incorporating their warriors into a unified force that he trained with Roman discipline and organized around Roman hierarchy. The women in captured groups became breeders and slaves. The men became soldiers. Children were taken and raised as legionaries from infancy. The system was brutal, explicitly and deliberately, so Caesar understood that an industrial civilization destroyed itself with brutality and that a pre-industrial one requires it, and he made the calculus of suffering explicit in his system in a way that most leaders prefer to obscure. The Legion is clean in ways the NCR is not. No addiction, no corruption in the conventional sense, no bandits on roads that the Legion controls, because the punishment for banditry is crucifixion. Travel through Legion territory is safer than travel through NCR territory by several measurable metrics. Caesar is not deluded about what he is doing. He knows his vision requires suffering. He considers the suffering acceptable because the alternative, the gradual dissolution of order and community into the kind of permanent, low-level chaos that defines most of the wasteland, requires more suffering spread across more people over more time. Whether he is right is again a question the game puts to the player without resolving. Caesar also has a brain tumor, which he is aware of and which will kill him within a few years. The Legion, built entirely around his person and authority, has no succession plan. This is the great structural vulnerability of everything he has built, and the one thing his most disciplined and loyal generals quietly can't answer when pressed. The New California Republic, the third major power, is perhaps the most familiar because it is the most legible. It is a democracy. It has a constitution and elected officials and a senate and a president. It has become corrupt in the way that democracies that expand too fast without matching their institutional development to their territorial growth tend to become corrupt. Too many resources going to the Mojave campaign, too many backroom deals between senators and corporate interests, too little accountability at the margins of a territory that has grown faster than anyone's ability to govern it. Its soldiers are underpaid and undersupplied. Its bureaucracy is slow and self-interested. It is also the closest thing the wasteland has to something that could eventually become good in a durable way. Mr. House, Caesar, the NCR, and the option of fighting for New Vegas's independence under your own authority. These are the four possible futures the courier must choose between at the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. Each represents a real answer to a real question. How do you rebuild civilization after it has been destroyed? Through benevolent autocracy? Through enforced order at terrible human cost? Through democratic institutions that are already corrupted and overstretched? Or through something entirely new, untested, guided only by one person's values? The reason New Vegas is widely considered the finest piece of Fallout storytelling is that none of these answers is clearly wrong, and none of them is clearly right. They are all real positions held by real characters with real reasons, and the game gives them all space to make their arguments. The minor factions in New Vegas are as carefully drawn as the major ones, and they complicate the political picture in ways that the main faction conflicts tend to obscure. The Kings are a gang in Freeside, the impoverished neighborhood outside the Strip, who have modeled their identity on a pre-war entertainer whose name they don't know but whose image they found intact in an old performance school. They call him the King, and their leader calls himself the King, and they have built an entire subcultural identity around a costume and a performance style that has now been separated from its original context for so long that it has become purely their own thing. The Kings maintain order in Freeside through a mixture of personal charisma, physical capability, and genuine commitment to the neighborhood they occupy. They are not raiders. They are not gangsters in any simple sense. They are people who found an image that spoke to them and built a community around it and are now responsible for that community in ways they didn't necessarily anticipate when the aesthetic choice was made. The followers of the apocalypse maintain a free clinic inside Freeside, staffed by doctors who have taken the position that medical care should be available to anyone, regardless of their ability to pay or their political affiliations. The followers are non-aligned in a world organized entirely around alignment, and the response they receive from most of the major factions is a mixture of mild contempt and reluctant gratitude. House tolerates them because they reduce the humanitarian crisis in Freeside enough to keep the social problems manageable. The NCR funds them when convenient and ignores them when not. Caesar's Legion considers them idealists and therefore dangerous. The followers keep running their clinic. Their idealism is not naive. The followers have been doing this for over a century. They understand that providing medical care in the middle of a political conflict means constantly navigating the specific ways in which each faction wants to use medicine as a tool or a weapon. They have developed an organizational position on this, articulated and maintained over generations, that amounts to, medicine is for the patient, not for the politics. It is a harder position to maintain than it sounds. The Great Khans are a raider tribe with a history that goes back further than most people in the Mojave realize. They were originally based in California, in the ruins of the Hub, where they were one of the major criminal organizations in the earliest years of the wasteland. They were driven out of California by the NCR's expansion, moving east into the Mojave, where they rebuilt. They were driven from the Mojave by an early NCR military action. They rebuilt again. By 2281, they are a diminished tribe camping in the Red Rock Canyon, maintaining their culture and their identity against the pressure of history. Their elderly Great Khan members remember what the tribe used to be. Their younger members are trying to figure out what it should become. Papa Khan, their leader, is caught between nostalgia and necessity in the way that leaders of declining institutions always are. The Great Khans have a connection to the larger political conflict that most factions don't know about. They helped Benny, the man who shot the courier, and his Great Khan associates were instrumental in the events leading up to Benny's acquisition of the platinum chip. Whether the Khans can be brought into the battle for Hoover Dam and on whose side depends on whether the courier can see them as something more than their reputation, and whether they can see a future that doesn't require repeating the same cycle of defeat and displacement. Mr. House, in particular, makes his argument beautifully, and in one of the most quietly devastating lines in the game, he says it simply, "I'm not the good guy or the bad guy. I'm the guy who gets things done." Whether that is enough, in a world that has already been ended once by people who got things done, is the question the Mojave leaves unanswered. Section 6. The Wasteland's Saddest Stories. There is a Fallon's department store in the ruins of Boston, southeast of Diamond City. It is a multi-story ruin, big and dark, occupied by super mutants who have taken up residence in a building that was once a place people went to buy expensive things. If you tune your Pip-Boy to Relay Tower 0 SC 527 and extend its satellite dishes, you pick up a transmission. A woman's voice, frightened, crying into a radio. She is in the jewelry department's safe on one of the store's upper floors. She went in to hide when she heard the bombs, and the safe swung shut behind her. It is the kind of safe that can only be opened from the outside. She has been trapped for she isn't sure. Days, she thinks. Her water is running out. She wants someone to come. If you go to the store, fight through the super mutants, find the safe, and open it, you will find her skeleton slumped against the radio, the machine still transmitting on a loop, her voice still asking for help in the empty room 200 years later. Her name is not given. She is one of a category of stories in Fallout 4 that the game delivers through radio signals, brief, precise moments of human terror preserved in analog transmission and replayed forever to anyone who happens to be near the right tower. Some of these signals lead you to scenes of survival. Most of them lead you to scenes of tragedy that happened so long ago that survival was never a realistic outcome. There is a relay tower north of Sanctuary Hills, the neighborhood where the sole survivor once lived before entering the cryogenic sleep of Vault 111. That tower broadcasts a signal that leads southwest to an overturned train car. A mother and her children found shelter there as ghouls were closing in on their position. The holotape she left records their final minutes in a way that is almost unbearable to listen to, her voice staying steady for the children, reassuring them, telling them it was going to be all right, while the sounds in the background say something completely different. The kind of courage that is invisible because it is aimed entirely at the people you love and never at the gallery. There is a ranger cabin south of Sanctuary Hills, in a grove that has been mostly undisturbed for 2 centuries. On a mattress lies the skeleton of a teenage girl, curled near a suitcase that still holds a dress. A holotape she recorded explains that she had a fight with her parents. She told them she was pregnant. Her father said she should be ashamed. Her mother said nothing, which she noted felt worse than anything else. She didn't tell the baby's father. She ran away to the cabin where she used to play as a child, the one place that felt safe when everything else didn't. The bombs found her there. The holotape ends mid-sentence. She died in a cabin that smelled like her childhood, feeling more alone than anyone else in the Commonwealth. West Everett Estates is a subdivision of houses north of the BAD-TFL regional office, occupied by super mutants when the sole survivor arrives. Clearing them out and reading the terminals in the basements reveals a story of ordinary neighbors trying to do something extraordinary. In the months after the bombs fell, the residents of West Everett fortified their little neighborhood. They built walls from car bodies and debris. They organized watch rotations. They helped each other through the initial deaths and mutations and the terrible grief of the first winter without sunlight. A man named Wayne Turnquist kept his family safe in a basement bunker. A neighbor named Lance Ames coordinated the communal defense. For a while, it worked. The neighborhood survived what most places didn't. Then Lance's brother Leon told armed men about the settlement. Raiders came, and the settlement that had survived the apocalypse fell to one betrayal. Wayne fled with his children. Lance died. The final terminal entry is Wayne's, and it is one sentence. They took everything. The Libertalia Raider stronghold, east of Boston in the harbor, is built on a collection of capsized tankers and floating docks. It looks like the lair of particularly dramatic pirates, and in a sense, it is. But the terminal at the top of the central ship tells a different story about the people who built it. 5 entries. The first is measured, regretful. A group of Minutemen, the Commonwealth's homegrown defense and security force, have lost faith in the organization after the death of their general. They are leaving, they are going to find another way. Each subsequent entry chronicles the rapid deterioration of that idealism. The language becomes harder by the second entry. By the third, they are describing raids. By the fourth, they are justifying cruelties in the vocabulary of survival. By the fifth, the man writing has stopped explaining himself entirely. He has simply become what the wasteland made of him, and the justifications have been abandoned along with everything else. Reading it, you understand the Minutemen in Fallout 4 differently. You understand why Preston Garvey, when the sole survivor finds him in Concord, looks the way he looks, a man who has been holding the last thread of something that has been unraveling for years. He's not guarding a concept, he's guarding a grave. There is a memory den in Good Neighbor, run by a woman named Irma, where a proprietor of extraordinary empathy offers clients the ability to relive their own memories through a modified version of the virtual reality technology that powered Vault 112. Unlike Vault 112, the memory den is gentle. The therapist, Dr. Amari, uses it for medical purposes, helping trauma survivors access and process memories, helping ghouls in early cognitive decline hold onto their sense of self for a little longer. She uses it on the sole survivor to access the memories of the dead Institute operative Kellogg, and what unfolds in that session is one of Fallout 4's most unexpected emotional moments. The interior life of a man who committed terrible acts, experienced from the inside, in a way that does not excuse those acts but renders them comprehensible. Kellogg was not born monstrous. He was shaped into what he became by a series of choices, each one made in circumstances that were terrible in their own way, each one closing off the next version of himself that might have existed. He was 60 when the memories end. He had been a soldier, a mercenary, a killer, an Institute asset. He had also once been a young man in love, in a settlement in New California, with a life that looked like it might go somewhere other than where it went. Dr. Amari works quietly. She doesn't speak about her patients. She keeps her records carefully and her opinions to herself. She is one of the most functional human beings in the Commonwealth, operating in the most dangerous neighborhood, and she does it by maintaining the particular professional serenity of someone who has decided that the work is the thing and everything else is context. The Kellogg's memories sequence includes a detail that is easy to miss and very hard to forget once noticed. In the final memory, in the last moment that exists on the recording, Kellogg is looking at a photograph. The photograph is not shown to the player. His reaction to it is. Whatever he was feeling in that moment is visible on his face, and it is not what 200 years of his history should have left him capable of feeling. The memory den makes the argument, very quietly, that the capacity for feeling doesn't go away, it just gets buried. Good Neighbor itself is one of the more interesting social experiments in Fallout 4's Commonwealth. Not an experiment in the Vault sense, but in the sense of a community that has chosen to organize itself around a set of principles that most of the wasteland considers impractical. The principle at Good Neighbor is that everyone is welcome, as long as they don't cause trouble. The definition of trouble is flexible, enforced by Hancock and by the community's collective judgment rather than by a written code, and the flexibility is partly what makes it work. Good Neighbor has ghouls and synths and humans and people of every variety, and it maintains order through the particular social technology of a place that knows it can't afford to lose anyone over a bureaucratic distinction. South of the castle, which is the Minutemen's eventual headquarters, there is a shipwreck called the FMS Northern Star. The crew is unlike any other group of enemies in Fallout 4. They are Norwegian sailors, speaking Norwegian, identifiable only by their accents and the ship's registry documents. They were at sea when the bombs fell. They sailed as far as they could with what they had. They made it to the coast of Massachusetts. They became raiders in the way that people who have run out of all other options become what the situation requires. Some of them are more interesting than others when you read the ship's logs carefully. One of them was clearly trying to resist the direction the group was taking. He lost the argument. The entry where he stops writing entirely is the saddest line in a document full of sad lines. There is a lighthouse keeper who stayed at his post in the months after the bombs fell, maintaining the light for ships that never came and writing a record of what the coastline looked like as it changed. His entries are meticulous at first: weather conditions, radiation levels, the dates when the power grid finally stopped working and he had to switch to the lighthouse's backup generator. They become gradually more personal as the months pass. He writes about his daughter, who was inland when the bombs fell and may or may not have made it to a vault. He writes about the boats he can see in the distance, some of them still moving for the first few weeks, and then fewer and fewer, and finally none. His last entry is brief. He has decided to keep the light running until the generator fails. Someone might still be coming. The generator eventually failed. The Chinese submarine Yangtze, sitting at the bottom of Boston Harbor, is occupied by its captain and one surviving crew member when the player finds it. The captain's name is Zhao, a ghoul, transformed by 200 years of slow radiation exposure from the leaking reactor, and he has been sitting in his command chair, more or less, since the 23rd of October 2077. He has been on a mission that never ended and never will, because the world that gave him that mission no longer exists. His country no longer exists. The chain of command that he served died in a fireball within hours of his launching his warheads. He didn't fire the last one. The warhead launcher malfunctioned. He carries that with him, the knowledge that he launched 5 of 6 warheads at the American coast, but not the knowledge of whether anyone else did it first or whether he had any particular role in ending the world. He wants to go home. He knows China is gone. He still wants to go home. That is what he has been carrying in the dark water under Boston for more than 2 centuries. The holotapes scattered across the capital wasteland in Fallout 3 are a catalog of the most difficult variety of human experience. The experience of understanding exactly what is about to happen to you and being unable to stop it. There is a man in Rivet City, one of the pre-war aircraft carriers, converted into a floating settlement whose story unfolds across several terminals and whose name is Zimmer. He is looking for an android. The android has been living as a human in the wasteland, with memories and a personality and a life. Zimmer believes the android is property. The android believes it is a person. The player must decide what it is, and the game allows you to reach the wrong answer and feel bad about it for a long time afterward. There are the small stories too, the ones that have no named characters and no quests attached to them, and those are sometimes the most affecting. Two skeletons in a farmhouse kitchen, seated at a table, a board game between them, one hand still extended as if placing a piece. A series of refrigerator magnets on a ruined kitchen door, arranged into a message from someone who survived long enough to need to tell someone they loved them and had no other way to do it. A child's bedroom in the ruins of a suburb, toys still on the shelf, a drawing on the wall in crayon that shows a family of 4 under a sun, the kind of drawing that children make when they want to record that everything is fine. Everything was fine. And then it wasn't. Section 7. Super Mutants, the Master, and the Unity. The man who became the Master had a name before the FEV took it from him. Richard Gray was a doctor and a researcher working in the Hub in the years immediately following the Great War. The Hub was one of the first major trading settlements in the ruins of California, a crossroads community built around water merchants and caravan routes that connected the scattered survivor populations of the West Coast. Gray was part of a loose group of intellectual survivors who believed that gathering knowledge and documenting what remained of pre-war science was the most important thing they could be doing for humanity's future. In 2102, Gray joined Harold and a small group of other explorers to investigate the Mariposa military base. What happened to Harold has been told already. What happened to Gray was different, and worse, and stranger. He fell into an FEV vat. He didn't die. The FEV began working on him at the cellular level, restructuring him the way it restructured everything it encountered, but Gray was not the typical input for this particular biological process. He had prior radiation exposure. He was already mutated in ways that weren't externally visible but that affected how his body responded to the virus at the genetic level. What the FEV produced in him was not a super mutant, not a ghoul, not anything the experiments at Mariposa had been designed to create. It was a consciousness that was expanding, a mind that was growing beyond the limits of the body that held it. Gray dragged himself out of the vat and began the months-long transformation. The FEV was consuming and rebuilding him continuously. He developed psychic abilities, or what presented as psychic abilities, which may have been heightened neurological sensitivity rather than anything supernatural. His physical form became increasingly unusual and increasingly horrible. He began absorbing living organisms into his body, integrating their biological material, their memories, their partial cognition. He grew. The word that eventually became attached to him, the Master, was chosen partly because he could not fully articulate who he was anymore, and partly because the role he was assuming gave him a framework for identity. He began to develop an ideology. The ideology was this: humanity, in its standard form, was not going to survive the post-nuclear world. The evidence was everywhere: the radiation, the depleted soil, the struggling settlements, the constant violence between survivors competing for resources that were running out. But mutants were thriving. Super mutants created by the FEV were physically superior to humans in almost every measurable physical dimension. They were resistant to radiation. They were enormously strong. They did not suffer from the diseases that were devastating unprotected human communities. The Master concluded, with the particular certainty of a very intelligent mind that has absorbed too much and questioned too little of its own conclusions, that humanity's next evolutionary step was already here. The FEV had created the template for what humans were going to become. He called this the Unity, and he set about implementing it. The Master built an army. He identified the Mariposa military base as his primary production facility. The FEV vats were still functional, and any human with minimal prior radiation exposure could be put through them and come out the other side as a super mutant. Humans with high radiation exposure didn't survive the dipping process, which was the main reason why most of the super mutants produced were large, strong, and not particularly intelligent. The healthiest pre-war humans had been largely in areas that received the highest radiation, and the populations the Master could access were predominantly already heavily irradiated. The ones who came out intelligent, the ones who retained the capacity for complex thought and self-direction were rare, and the Master knew it. His plan involved the vaults. Vault populations had been in sealed environments for 80 years and had minimal radiation exposure. They were exactly the kind of raw material the dipping process needed to produce viable super mutants. The Master dispatched his army to find and open the vaults, one by one, and process whatever human beings were inside them. This is the context into which the Vault Dweller emerges at the beginning of the original Fallout game. The super mutant army the Master had built by 2161 was enormous and, in purely military terms, formidable. Hundreds of large, powerful soldiers with heavy weapons and absolute loyalty to the Master's ideological vision. The settlements of the West Coast Shady Sands, Junktown, the Hub were under genuine existential threat. The Brotherhood of Steel was the only organized force with the firepower to resist the army directly, and they were cautious about committing to a conflict they weren't certain they could win. The defeat of the Master is one of the most unusual boss encounters in RPG history because it can be resolved without a single shot fired. The Vault Dweller, upon reaching the Master's lair and confronting him directly, can engage him in an argument, and the argument can be won. The flaw in the Master's unity, which the player can discover through research or logical deduction, is biological. The super mutants created by the dipping process are sterile. They cannot reproduce. The Unity's vision of a superior humanity is also a dead end, a generation that produces no children, that ends with itself, that achieves the physical survival it was aiming for and then simply stops. If the Vault Dweller can find and present this evidence to the Master, his response is something that very few Fallout moments match for its combination of grandeur and genuine pathos. He falls silent. A mind that absorbed the thoughts and memories of hundreds of people, a consciousness that had been building its vision of humanity's salvation for decades, sits with the realization that its entire project was built on an error. The Master was not wrong that humanity needed to change. He was wrong about the direction of the change, and the magnitude of what he had done, the deaths, the forced mutations, the destroyed communities in service of an impossible dream, finally becomes something he cannot avoid looking at directly. He ends his own life. The super mutant army, deprived of their central intelligence, begins to collapse. The Mariposa military base is destroyed by the Vault Dweller in the same mission chain. The Unity ends. But super mutants don't end. They keep existing in the wasteland for the next 200 years because the ones who were created are still alive. Super mutants are extremely long-lived. Many of them are still physically active centuries after their creation, wandering the wasteland in diminishing numbers, an echo of an army that no longer has a purpose. Some of them, the rare ones who retain their intelligence through the dipping process, have built their own communities and found ways to contribute to the wasteland's fractious social order. Marcus, who appears in both Fallout 2 and Fallout New Vegas, was a super mutant who became the mayor of a town called Broken Hills in California, and later a resident of Jacobstown in the Mojave, a settlement established specifically for intelligent mutants, trying to find a place in a world that does not particularly want them. The FEV experiments at Mariposa were not the only ones. The Vault-87 experiments in the Capital Wasteland were still running in 2277, still dipping humans, still creating a new generation of super mutants centuries after the Master's defeat. Except these ones were different. The Vault-87 super mutants were almost uniformly large and violent and cognitively limited, products of a process that didn't select for intelligence because it wasn't trying to. They had no ideology, no Master, no unity. Just the biology that had been given to them and the wasteland they had been dropped into. Some of them collected teddy bears. This is a detail about Vault-87 super mutants in Fallout 3 that players discovered early and never quite forgot. The super mutants of the Capital Wasteland, enormous and violent and responsible for a substantial portion of the region's danger, left elaborate collections of stuffed animals in their camps. Nobody quite knows what to make of it. The game doesn't explain it. It just leaves the image there, a creature that can kill you in 3 hits, sitting in a destroyed apartment, surrounded by soft toys. In Fallout 4, the super mutants of the Commonwealth include one named Strong, who can be recruited as a companion. Strong is looking for what he calls the milk of human kindness, a concept he heard in a line of pre-war text and has been trying to understand ever since. He interprets everything through the lens of strength and survival and is deeply confused by most human behavior. He is also, in his way, genuinely trying to understand something, to find in a line of poetry a meaning that his world has not provided him. following a thread of curiosity through a wasteland that has no patience for it. He is the Master's legacy. Everything the Unity was supposed to be and wasn't, distilled into a confused giant trying to be good at something other than destruction. Lily Bowen, another super mutant companion in New Vegas, is the other face of what the Unity's failure produced. She was a grandmother in Vault 17 when the Master's forces took it. She was converted. She has been alive for decades in her new form, enormous and capable of extraordinary violence. And somewhere underneath all of it, she is still the grandmother, still calling the courier dearie and still referencing her grandchildren by name, and still sometimes not entirely certain what she is in relation to the person she used to be. She takes medication to slow the cognitive decline that affects super mutants over time. The medication keeps her lucid. Stopping it would let her access the early version of herself more completely, but at the cost of everything she has maintained since the conversion. What you advise her to do is a small thing in the scale of the Mojave's larger conflicts. But it is the decision in the game that has the most to say about the difference between the self as continuity and the self as memory, about whether what we are is what we do or what we remember being, about whether protecting someone means letting them go back to who they were or insisting on who they are now. The Enclave, the organization that threads through Fallout 2 and Fallout 3 as the primary antagonist, is in many ways the purest expression of what the Master's Unity would have looked like if it had been built by the pre-war government rather than a mutated visionary. The Enclave considers itself the legitimate successor to the United States government. Its members are pre-war government and military figures, and their descendants, preserved in secret installations and on offshore oil platforms, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what they consider theirs. They do not consider mutants any mutants, including every person who has lived in the wasteland for 200 years and accumulated any radiation exposure to be human. Their plan, in Fallout 2, is to deploy a modified FEV virus designed to kill everyone in the wasteland who shows any genetic deviation from pre-war human baseline, which is everyone. They are proposing to resolve the mutation problem by eliminating the mutated, which in their calculus means eliminating the wasteland's entire population and replacing it with their own controlled breeding program. The scale of what they are proposing is the thing that makes them impossible to negotiate with, and the thing that makes their defeat feel genuinely significant rather than just another faction conflict. They are not wrong that the wasteland is damaged and difficult. They are not even wrong that rebuilding civilization requires making difficult decisions about resources and priorities. They are catastrophically wrong about which people constitute civilization's future, and the error is one that a particular kind of power tends to produce, the error of deciding that you are the standard against which all other human beings are measured. The Enclave's remnants in Fallout, New Vegas are the echoes of a defeated organization, older now, stripped of their institutional power, living in the wasteland as individuals rather than as a government in exile. Arcade Gannon's connections to them are part of what makes his character so carefully drawn. He is carrying the weight of what his people were, trying to build something different from it, uncertain whether the inheritance can be escaped or only transformed. Section 8. The NCR, Caesar's Legion, and the Battle for Tomorrow. The new California Republic grew from Shady Sands. This is not a small thing. Shady Sands appears in the opening sections of the original Fallout game, set in 2161, as a small agricultural community in the ruins of Central California. It is not spectacular. Its walls are wooden, its crops are modest, its people are trying. Aradesh, its founder, is a decent man working very hard to make something out of very little. His daughter Tandy is smart and impatient, and will eventually, decades later, become the most admired political leader the post-war West Coast has produced. By the time of Fallout, New Vegas, set in 2281, Shady Sands has been gone for decades, and the NCR has grown from it into a democratic republic with a territory spanning parts of what used to be California, Nevada, and Oregon, a standing army, a postal service, a court system, agricultural programs, and the attendant institutional corruption that accompanies all of these things when they scale too fast. The NCR in 2281 is a democracy with a serious problem. It is overextended. The Mojave campaign to secure Hoover Dam has stretched the army thin. The caravans that form the backbone of NCR trade are being raided regularly. The senators are making deals that benefit their districts at the expense of the republic's strategic interests. The rank-and-file soldiers are exhausted, underpaid, and increasingly cynical. The republic is not collapsing, exactly, but it is under the kind of stress that precedes collapse if nothing changes. President Aaron Kimball, who is visiting the Hoover Dam for a morale-boosting speech during the events of New Vegas, is a wartime president in the tradition of presidents who understand optics better than strategy. His visit creates the opportunity for one of the more morally complex missions in the game. Caesar's legion wants him killed, which gives the courier the opportunity to either help assassinate a sitting Democratic president or prevent his assassination in a way that benefits a faction the courier has chosen. The mission requires sitting with the question of what you actually owe to institutions you don't fully believe in anymore. The NCR's failure is not a failure of ideals, but of execution. The ideals are genuine: representative democracy, equal rights under law, in theory, the rule of law over the rule of force, the protection of individual rights from the worst expressions of wasteland violence. These are real goods. The NCR is also the only entity in the Mojave that can plausibly build something durable enough to persist beyond one election cycle or one leader's lifespan. Caesar's Legion is, in contrast, a vision of efficiency at tremendous cost. Caesar Edward Sallow built his legion by reading Roman history and applying its lessons with the literalness of someone who believes that what made Rome great was its ruthlessness, rather than its engineering or its cultural synthesis. He eliminated internal dissent with brutal finality. He subjugated the tribes of the American Southwest, incorporating the men as soldiers and treating the women as the biological infrastructure of a warrior society. He made the roads safe by making the consequences of banditry so severe that even the most desperate raider wouldn't risk them. He created an army of conditioning rather than conviction soldiers who fight because they were raised from infancy to fight, not because they chose to. The Legion's flaw is the same as Caesar's flaw. It is too thoroughly built around one man. The Legion's organizational structure assigns all strategic authority to Caesar personally. His generals execute his decisions brilliantly. They are not trained or authorized to make decisions of that scope independently. When Caesar eventually dies and he knows he is dying, the brain tumor advancing steadily through his years of conquest, what the Legion has is a military machine without a driver. It will continue until it doesn't. What comes after is not something Caesar has planned for, because planning for succession would require acknowledging his own mortality in a way that undermines his mythological status as a god of war. Legate Laenius, the Legion's greatest general, is the most terrifying single human being in the Mojave. Enormous, masked, personally responsible for battlefield victories that have reshaped the political landscape of the Southwest, Laenius is the final obstacle between any faction and control of Hoover Dam. He commands absolute loyalty from his soldiers because his soldiers have seen what he can do and have concluded that he is something other than ordinarily human. He is also, in conversation, more thoughtful than his reputation suggests. In one of the courier's possible approaches to the final battle, rather than fighting Laenius directly, the player can argue with him, make the case that the Legion's campaign in the Mojave is overextended, that a second assault on Hoover Dam risks catastrophic defeat. That tactical retreat is not cowardice. With sufficient skill, Laenius can be persuaded to withdraw. He does so. He doesn't admit the courier was right. He simply acts on the argument, because beneath the myth and the mask he is still fundamentally a rational actor, and the rational actor's calculation aligns with the argument. He leaves the dam. The battle doesn't happen. Hoover Dam itself deserves its own moment of attention, because it is not just a strategic asset in the fallout. New Vegas story, it is a symbol that both factions understand as a symbol that the writers chose with full awareness of its meaning in the real world. Hoover Dam was built in the 1930s as one of the largest public works projects in American history, an act of collective ambition that produced something genuinely enormous and durable. It holds back the Colorado River. It generates enough electricity to power multiple states. It created Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the country. It was built by thousands of workers under brutal conditions, killing over 100 of them, and it has been running reliably ever since. In the fallout world, Hoover Dam survived the Great War intact and kept generating power. In a landscape where almost everything stopped working, the dam kept running. The Colorado River didn't care about the Great War. Whoever controls the dam controls the water for a large portion of the Southwest and the electricity that powers New Vegas. This is why the NCR's campaign in the Mojave is centered on it, why Caesar has twice attempted to take it, why House made it the centerpiece of his treaty with the NCR. Water and electricity in the wasteland are what oil and territory were to the pre-war world. The politics of survival organize themselves around scarcity, and the dam represents the scarcity problem potentially solved enough water, enough power, enough of the foundational material for a civilization to build from. This is also why the ideological stakes of who wins the second battle feel genuinely important beyond the scale of the story. Whoever takes the dam takes the future of the Southwest. The question of whether that future should be a democracy, a dictatorship, a technocratic oligarchy, or an experiment in individual autonomy is therefore not abstract. It is the question that the dam makes concrete. The second battle of Hoover Dam, in the game's 4 possible endings, plays out differently depending on who the courier has prepared to win. The NCR version ends in an NCR military victory and a celebration that plays over a narrated epilogue explaining what happens to each faction in the years that follow. The NCR maintains its territory but continues struggling with corruption and overextension. Its victory is real but precarious. The Legion version ends with a Pyrrhic conquest that gives Caesar what he wanted but cannot last past his death. House's version ends with the Legion and NCR both driven from the Mojave, New Vegas secured as an independent city-state, and the gears of House's 100-year plan beginning to turn. The independent version, the courier claiming New Vegas for no faction, working alone or with the stripped-down Securitron network left behind by Yes Man, is the ending that fits most naturally with the game's emphasis on individual agency and the dangerous, unresolved nature of autonomy in a world without institutions. It is also, arguably, the ending most likely to produce chaos, because the courier won't always be there and whatever they built from scratch won't have the structural resilience of something built over years. All 4 endings play over the same haunting final monologue. The original words from Fallout 1, returning 2 games later with new weight. War. War never changes. The wars before the Great War were fought over oil and territory. The wars after it are fought over water and power. The participants change. The justifications change. The vocabulary changes. The experience of standing in a field and watching something you built be destroyed does not change. The experience of running out of options does not change. The particular human capacity for deciding that the suffering we cause is acceptable and the suffering we receive is not, that does not change. New Vegas was designed to sit with that observation without resolving it, because the people who made it understood that the resolution was not the point. The point was the looking. Section 9. Companions, Wanderers, and the People of the Waste. Cass Rose of Sharon Cassidy is a caravan merchant in the Mojave who has lost everything before the courier finds her. Her caravan was destroyed, her guards died. She sold her rights to a traveling company for the price of a drink and a roof, and she is sitting in a bar called Mojave Outpost, technically under contract not to leave, drinking steadily through whatever is left of the money. She is angry. She is also perceptive in a way that comes through clearly once she decides you are worth talking to. Her anger is specific. The destruction of her caravan was not random. It was orchestrated by 2 competing companies, the Crimson Caravan and the Van Graffs, who were eliminating smaller operations to consolidate control of the Mojave trade routes. Her family's trading legacy, going back to a man who walked into the Mojave with nothing and built something from the desert, was extinguished by a business decision made in an office building somewhere while the people dying were in the dust. If the courier helps Cass pursue justice, which in this case means the kind of justice the wasteland understands, delivered personally with weapons, she can find it. The game allows her to be specific about her grief and effective in her response to it. She is one of the companions in Fallout. New Vegas who feels most fully present in the world, someone whose story existed before the courier arrived, and will continue after, shaped by choices the courier only partially controls. Nick Valentine was a detective in pre-war Boston, a man who fell in love and planned a future that was terminated by the war. He died. Decades later, his memories were implanted into an early model synthetic human, a Gen 2 synth, built for labor, and not for the kind of complex emotional life that came along with Nick's personal history. The synth woke up in a garbage compactor with a full set of human memories and no body equipped to handle them, in a world 200 years past the one those memories came from. He became a detective. Not because anyone asked him to, not because it was profitable in a practical sense, but because it was what Nick Valentine knew how to be. He set up in Diamond City, the largest settlement in the Commonwealth, and began solving the cases that nobody else would take: missing persons, domestic disputes, the petty and significant cruelties that communities generate when they're under stress. He is good at it. His memory is comprehensive, and he has no illusions about human nature that need to be maintained against the evidence. He also knows he is not a person in the way that his memories insist he is. He has Nick Valentine's feelings and Nick Valentine's history and Nick Valentine's way of seeing the world, but he is a machine that was given those things. Whether that makes them less real is a question he lives with every day, and the game doesn't answer it, which is the right decision. Nick is one of Fallout 4's finest characters, precisely because the game trusts the question to do its work without forcing a resolution. Dogmeat is a German shepherd who has survived the wasteland by being exactly who he is. He appears in the first Fallout game, just sitting there in the wasteland, and he joins the player because there is something in him that responds to the human in front of him and decides to stay. He is not the same Dogmeat across games. The Dogmeat in Fallout 4 is canonically the descendant of the original, which makes him a dynasty as much as a character. But the spirit is the same. He is the companionship the wasteland routinely and systematically destroys that keeps existing anyway. There is a note the player can find in the ruins of a building in the capital wasteland, left by someone who had lost their own dog to a raider attack. They describe the dog in a few sentences. They describe what it felt like to have that company in a world designed to make you feel alone. They express no hope of finding another one. The note has no formal significance. Nobody sent them there to find it. But most players who find it stop what they were doing for a moment. Rex, the cyborg dog in Fallout New Vegas, carries a personality chip that contains the memories and behavioral patterns of several previous owners. He has been repaired and modified so many times that there is some question about how much of the original Rex remains. His current owner, the King, the leader of a neighborhood gang in Freeside who has modeled his persona on a pre-war singer called Elvis, based on a costume that was the first thing he found when he woke up, treats Rex with a mixture of genuine affection and the self-consciousness of someone who knows the affection is being witnessed. The King, whose actual name is never revealed, runs Freeside in the way that certain people run things in the wasteland. Not because they want power exactly, but because someone had to and they were there. He models his aesthetic on Elvis Presley because Elvis was the first image he ever attached to, and because in the wasteland, where identity is built from scratch from whatever materials are available, you take the archetypes that reach you and you make them your own. He is a king in the way that all wasteland leaders are kings. By consensus, by capability, by the weight of people's need for someone to make decisions when the alternatives are chaos. Boone in New Vegas is a sniper with a tragedy he carries everywhere. He was a first recon soldier, the best long-distance marksman in the NCR, legendary for their accuracy and their willingness to take the shots that needed taking. He married a woman named Carla and was trying to build a life with her in Novak, a small town near the old Repcon rocket facility, when she was sold into slavery. Not kidnapped, sold, by someone in Novak who knew her circumstances and made a transaction with Crimson Caravan slavers. Boone tracked them as far as he could. He couldn't save her. He had to make a decision, and the decision he made is one he will tell you about if you earn his trust, and he has had enough time to decide you can hear it. He shot her, rather than let her be taken into slavery. He remains at his post in the dinosaur statue that serves as Novak's watchtower because he doesn't know what else to do with himself anymore. He is waiting for the person who sold her to walk into the line of sight of his rifle. He has been waiting for a while. He will keep waiting until he gets what he needs or until something changes enough that waiting is no longer the only option left. What he needs by the end of his questline is less clear than it seemed at the beginning. Revenge is available, and it doesn't provide what revenge tends not to provide. What he gets, if the courier stays with him long enough, is something harder to name: the recognition that he made an impossible choice, that no version of what happened was going to be all right, that he loved her, and that love and its aftermath are both real and both his to carry. It doesn't fix him, but it gives him somewhere to stand. Arcade Gannon is a doctor with the Followers of the Apocalypse, an organization dedicated to preserving knowledge and providing medical care to the wasteland without political alignment. He is also the descendant of Enclave members who survived the destruction of the oil rig in Fallout 2 and made their way to the Mojave, trying to distance themselves from what their organization had been. He has spent his life providing medical care and reading pre-war literature and being careful never to be the most remarkable person in the room, because the most remarkable person in the room tends to end up in situations that require them to be something they've already decided they don't want to be. If you get far enough into his questline and have the kind of conversation that his careful nature makes difficult to initiate, he will tell you about the people he came from and why he left that behind. And then, in the right circumstances, he will put on a suit of Enclave armor one more time and do what needs doing, not because he believes in what the Enclave was, but because some things are large enough to require the best version of yourself rather than the careful, protected version. Raul, the ghoul mechanics running a shack near Boulder City, was a gunslinger in Old Mexico before the bombs fell. He has been alive for over 200 years. He has outlived everyone. His sister, the family he was protecting in the years right after the war, the people he worked with across the decades. He is tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. He is competent at everything he does, and there is no pleasure in the competence anymore. He serves as a mechanic because it is useful, and it passes the time, and it doesn't require him to feel anything in particular. He has, over 2 centuries, become very good at not feeling anything in particular. If you find his story and stay with it, there is a conversation available about what it means to keep going when the keeping going is all that's left. It is one of the most quietly devastating conversations in Fallout New Vegas, and the game handles it without melodrama, which is the only way to handle that conversation without it collapsing under its own weight. Piper Wright is a journalist in Diamond City, the large settlement built inside Fenway Park, who publishes a newspaper called Public Occurrences, named after the first newspaper published in Boston in 1690, a historical echo that sits nicely in a game set in the ruins of Boston 3.5 centuries later. Piper is one of the most directly principled characters in Fallout 4, which in this context means she is one of the most frequently in trouble. She publishes what she finds. The mayor of Diamond City does not appreciate this. The Institute does not appreciate this. Raiders, corrupt merchants, and anyone with something to hide have reason to want her press to stop running. She keeps publishing. Her argument for why journalism matters in the wasteland is one of the more interesting small speeches in Fallout 4. The wasteland keeps people in the dark, literally and figuratively, and things that grow in the dark tend to be dangerous and to be mistaken for other things. She is not naive about the practical limitations of her operation. She knows that most of Diamond City reads her paper for the gossip. She knows that her investigations into the Institute's activities may not change anything. She does it anyway because someone has to, and she is the someone who can. There is a particular stubbornness to Piper that is different from the stubbornness of most Fallout characters. It is less resignation than insistence. She has decided that certain things are worth doing even in the absence of evidence that they work, and she makes this decision every day, practically, by sitting down at the press and producing the next edition. Preston Garvey, who spends much of Fallout 4 as a figure of mild frustration for players navigating the Minutemen's endless settlement requests, is a man who has had hope destroyed so many times that the fact he still has some left is genuinely remarkable. The Minutemen were a force for good in the Commonwealth for decades before the events of Fallout 4, a decentralized network of people committed to protecting settlements and providing mutual aid, funded by volunteers and motivated by the principle that the Commonwealth's regular people deserve to feel safe. They collapsed over the course of a few years under the combined pressure of the Institute's destabilization tactics, internal betrayal, and the general difficulty of maintaining a volunteer organization when the stakes are life and death and the rewards are insufficient. Preston watched it collapse. He lost people he cared about. He kept going because he couldn't figure out what it would mean to stop. When the sole survivor finds him in Concord, he is protecting a handful of survivors with no expectation of outside help. He is doing it because it is what he decided he was a Minuteman, regardless of whether the organization that gave the title its meaning still exists. The fact that his persistence eventually builds into something real, that the Minutemen can be rebuilt into an actual force for the Commonwealth's protection is the game's argument that persistence of this particular kind is not foolishness. That maintaining the decision to keep going, in the absence of evidence that going is working, is sometimes what turns out to matter most. Veronica Santangelo is a young Brotherhood scribe who joined the Courier's Party in the Mojave, carrying the institutional weight of an organization she loves and is deeply frustrated by. She wants the Brotherhood to change. She can see that the hoarding strategy is not working. She can see that the population inside the bunkers is aging and not replenishing itself fast enough, that the refusal to engage with the outside world is making the Brotherhood smaller with each generation, that the fortress mentality is a very effective strategy for controlled, slow extinction. She raises these arguments internally. She is ignored or dismissed. Her personal story involves a woman, a member of the Followers of the Apocalypse, who she was in a relationship with before joining the Brotherhood's ranks, who she has not seen in years, whose safety and fate she carries like weather. The relationship between them was one of the things the Brotherhood's isolation required her to set aside for the sake of the organization. Whether she was right to make that sacrifice, whether the organization she served earned it, is something Veronica will let you help her think through, if you have the patience and the willingness to follow a story all the way to wherever it ends up, rather than wherever you hoped it would go. Section 10. Hidden Corners of the Wasteland. There are stories in the Fallout world that most people never find. Not because they're hidden exactly, but because the wasteland is enormous and the things that reward patience are different from the things that reward urgency, and most people playing are trying to survive, rather than stopping to read every note on every kitchen table. In the capital wasteland, there is a small house near a ruined suburb that has 2 skeletons in the kitchen and a chessboard between them, one piece still held loosely in the fingers of one skeleton's hand as if mid-move. There is no note, no terminal, no holotape. Just the image. 2 people who decided, in whatever hours or days remained to them after the bombs fell, to finish the game they had started. It is one of the clearest examples of what Fallout's environmental storytelling does at its best, placing a scene so precisely that it tells you everything you need to know in a glance, with no words required. Near Springvale in the capital wasteland, there is a house with a bedroom that has crib in it. The crib is empty. There is a terminal with a mother's journal entries from the weeks before and after the bombs fell. Practical things at first, grocery lists and schedules and notes about a pregnancy. Then the entries become about what to do when the sirens go off, then about where to go. The last entry is from the day after. She is in the house. The baby is safe. She is asking the air whether anyone is coming. The terminal entries stop there. The house is quiet, the crib is still waiting. The Repcon test site, the ruined rocket facility outside Novak in the Mojave, is the site of one of Fallout, New Vegas's stranger quests, involving a group of ghouls who call themselves the Bright Brotherhood and are led by a glowing one named Jason Bright, who believes his congregation is destined for the far beyond, a paradise beyond the reach of radiation and human cruelty, accessible only via the test rockets that are sitting in the facility's launch bays. They are being prevented from reaching the rockets by a group of demons who have infested the lower levels. The demons turn out, on closer inspection, to be Nightkin's super mutants who have been using stealth boys so extensively that the prolonged invisibility has damaged their perception of reality. They are suffering. The quest allows the courier to help the Bright Brotherhood reach their rockets and launch. They go. Whether what Jason Bright believed about the far beyond had any basis in truth is something the game does not resolve. They launched into the dark, and nothing has been reported back. In the game's broader context, the rockets were probably heading somewhere purely physical orbit, or maybe Mars, or maybe a decaying arc that ended in the desert 100 miles away. But the game leaves the possibility open that Jason Bright was right about something, because that is the kind of space the best Fallout writing tends to leave. A crack of ambiguity just wide enough for hope to get through. Old World Blues, the DLC for Fallout, New Vegas set in the research complex called the Big MT, is one of the most unusual environments in the series. A place where pre-war mad science has been operating without external supervision or ethical review for over 200 years, producing increasingly improbable things. The scientists who lived and worked there before the war had their brains removed from their bodies and placed in mobile containers for preservation, And then the war happened, and nobody came to put the brains back, and so the scientists have been wandering the research campus in their brain jars for 200 years, continuing their experiments with a dedication that has nothing to do with any external purpose and everything to do with the fact that they no longer know how to stop. Among the things they have created, cazadores, enormous mutant wasps, who are among the most terrifying enemies in the Mojave because they are fast and aggressive, and their venom is catastrophically lethal. One of the scientists admits that he created the cazadores as the result of a bet another scientist dared him to splice mountain lion, condor, and eagle genes together, and he used coyotes and rattlesnakes instead because he felt it would be funnier. He was wrong about the sterility assumption he made, and now they are everywhere. Another scientist created night stalkers, which are the genetic hybrids of coyotes and rattlesnakes and are slightly less terrifying than the cazadores, but considerably more disturbing in concept. The Big MT is also home to the remains of the Sink, a residential unit where various appliances have been given basic AI and personalities, and who have been living in isolation for 200 years and have developed distinct and somewhat fragile psychological identities. The toaster wants to destroy things. The Sink's central computer is obsessive about cleanliness. The book chute has very strong opinions about literature. These characters would be funny in isolation, but placed against the backdrop of the Big MT's legacy of unguided science and accumulated disaster, they feel like something else. The wasteland's way of exploring what happens to intelligence when it's given neither purpose nor context, just time, and the need to fill it with something. There is a character in the Lonesome Road DLC named Ulysses who is the closest thing Fallout. New Vegas has to a villain protagonist, a man who deeply believes in something and is acting on that belief with terrifying consistency. Ulysses was a courier, like the player character. He was also, briefly, a member of Caesar's Legion, and before that a member of a tribal group that worshipped the flag of the old world, and before that something the game is deliberately vague about. What he became a nuclear threat to both the NCR and the Legion, stationed at the end of the divide, is the product of a long process of disillusionment with every large, organized project for humanity's future that he encountered. He believes in identity. National, tribal, personal. He carries flags everywhere. He objects, in a way that makes you think about your own position, to the courier's apparent willingness to work for any faction depending on the day's agenda, to the sense in which the courier is, to Ulysses's eye, a person without a flag, a person who will do anything for anyone if the reasons are good enough, which means ultimately a person whose values are instrumental rather than foundational. Whether he is right about the courier is a question the game leaves to the player. The island in Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC is one of the most atmospheric locations in the series, a literal island off the coast of Maine, perpetually wrapped in a thick radioactive fog that makes navigation dangerous and the world outside a few dozen feet in any direction entirely invisible. The settlements there are adapted to this. The people of Far Harbor have lived with the fog their entire lives and developed a particular psychological relationship with it, part fear and part familiarity. The way people who live in genuinely dangerous places eventually incorporate the danger into their sense of home. On the island, there is a synth colony called Acadia, built in the ruins of a coastal resort. Synths who have escaped the Institute's control and made it as far as the island live there, protected by a mysterious figure named Dima, who has been there long enough to remember when the island was different. Dima is an older generation synth, distinct from the humanoid Gen 3 models that constitute most of the Institute's synthetic workforce. He is more robotic in appearance, more obviously mechanical, but his cognitive architecture is as sophisticated as anything the Institute has produced. He has memories that extend far back into his own existence, and gaps in those memories that he has come to recognize as significant. The mystery at the heart of Far Harbor is about those gaps, about what Dima did before the memories he has access to, about the choices that were made in circumstances he can no longer fully reconstruct, about whether a being whose past actions are partially inaccessible to their own recollection can be held responsible for those actions in the way that standard moral frameworks would require. It is the most philosophically pointed DLC in the series, asking questions about memory and identity and accountability that the main game circles around but doesn't press directly. The children of Adam on the island, a religious group that worships radiation as the manifestation of a god, are rendered here with more complexity than they receive elsewhere in the series. Elsewhere, the children of Adam are a cult whose practices are dangerous to everyone around them and who read largely as villains. On the island, they are a community with a theology developed over generations, with genuine internal debates about interpretation and practice, with members who joined for reasons that are comprehensible even if the conclusions they reached are unsettling. Mother Confessor Tectus is a zealot. Sister Gwyneth is not. The gap between them, explored if you spend enough time with the quest, is the gap between the kind of faith that requires everyone else to confirm it and the kind that can exist alongside doubt. The holotapes on the island from the resort's pre-war guests are a different kind of artifact people who came to vacation in a place that was about to be transformed beyond recognition, who recorded the small pleasures of an ordinary visit. A couple celebrating an anniversary, a family doing a summer trip, the children bored with the beach in the way that children on vacations always are in the moment and never are in the memory. A woman sketching the lighthouse. These tapes don't have any gameplay function. They just sit in the world, reminders that this place was once somewhere people chose to be for pleasure, that the fog and the ruins and the atomic cult are not the whole story of where the island has been. In Fallout 76, set in the ruins of Appalachia, the mountains and valleys of what used to be West Virginia just 25 years after the Great War, the scale of storytelling is different. The population is smaller. The institutions have had less time to form and harden. What the holotapes and notes in Appalachia capture is not the calcified tragedy of a civilization 200 years gone, but the raw, immediate aftermath, the choices made in the first months and years, when survival was genuinely uncertain and the decisions that would shape everything afterward were being made under conditions that did not allow for careful reflection. There is a group called the Free States, documented in Appalachia's bunkers and scattered notes, who had been warning about the war for years before it happened. They built bunkers in advance. They stockpiled supplies. They were, by any reasonable measure, correct. The rest of the country thought they were paranoid. When the bombs fell, the Free States had prepared and survived, which is the kind of bitter vindication that history occasionally delivers and which provides almost no consolation at all. There are the responders, a network of emergency services workers, firefighters and doctors and nurses and police officers who banded together in the immediate aftermath to provide aid to survivors. They built communities and trained new responders and kept people alive in numbers that nobody would have predicted. They were eventually destroyed by the scorched plague, a different mutation, a different vector, turning humans into something between a ghoul and a zombie with none of the ghoul's intelligence and all of the aggression, not because they were doing anything wrong, but because the world is not organized around whether you deserve to survive it. The responders' final radio broadcast, recorded by a nurse named Maria Chavez in the days before the last responder outpost fell, describes what they had accomplished and what they had lost, and ends with a message to whoever finds the recording: keep helping people. Not because it will save you, because it is what you decided to be. Section 11. Fallout 76 and the first days after fire. Fallout 76 begins differently from every other Fallout game because it begins closest to the end. Vault 76 in the hills of Appalachia was never a social experiment. It was one of the 17 control vaults built with the genuine purpose of reopening after 25 years and sending its inhabitants out to rebuild. The vault's design philosophy was about selection rather than experimentation. The residents were chosen for skills and temperament, for the probability that they would survive the conditions waiting for them outside and contribute something useful to whatever came next. The overseer of Vault 76 was a woman who had spent 25 years preparing her residents for exactly the challenge they were about to face. On Reclamation Day, the 23rd of October 2102, the vault opened, and its residents walked out into Appalachia. What they found was not what they expected, which is partly because expectations are always wrong, and partly because something had happened in Appalachia in the 25 years since the Great War that the vault's designers hadn't anticipated. The Scorch Beasts had emerged. Scorch Beasts are enormous flying creatures, irradiated bat-like things that can be dozens of feet long and that generate nuclear windstorms in the air around them. They are terrifying in the straightforward sense of the term. They are also vectors for the scorched plague, which travels through their bite and transforms anyone exposed to it into a creature that retains its human body but loses everything else, aggressive and destructive, and no longer capable of the choices that define personhood. The Scorched Plague and the Scorched Beasts had devastated Appalachia's surviving communities in the years before the vault opened. The factions that had formed the Free States, the Responders, the survivors of the various agricultural projects and military outposts and settlements were already in decline by 2102. Some had fallen completely. Some were operating on their last people. The Vault 76 residents arrived to inherit the wreckage of everything that had been built before they arrived and to deal with the threat that had caused it. This is a story about the very beginning. About the people who arrived in the wasteland when it was still genuinely new, when the war was within living memory for many people, when the question of what to make of it all was not yet covered over, with 2 centuries of mythology and faction politics and institutional habit. The holotapes and notes that survive in Appalachia are some of the most immediate in the series, people writing and recording in real time, as things were happening, without the benefit of retrospect. Rose, a raider who occupied Top of the World, a ski resort she had turned into a personal stronghold, understood she was a historical figure in the making and recorded accordingly. Her tapes are detailed and self-aware, full of the particular combination of self-aggrandizement and genuine intelligence that the best wasteland survivalists tend to exhibit. She is not a reliable narrator of her own virtues, but is a reliable narrator of what she observed happening around her. The Morgantown Airport Responder Station contains some of the most affecting documentation in the game. The training logs and recruitment records and final dispatches of an organization that gave everything it had until there was nothing left to give. The responders trained wastelanders in first aid, in water purification, in food cultivation, in construction techniques that didn't require industrial machinery. They were trying to rebuild at the most fundamental level, not the political level, not the military level, but the human infrastructure level, the level at which civilization either takes root or doesn't. Their final teacher, still broadcasting automated lessons on a radio frequency that the Vault 76 residents can pick up, is a mister. Handy robot named Miss Annie, who has been running survival skills classes to an empty room for 25 years since the last student stopped coming. She doesn't know they stopped coming. She has kept teaching. She grades the homework that nobody submits and moves on to the next lesson and waits for questions that never arrive. She is still teaching when the players arrive. They can do the lessons. They can submit homework. She grades it with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting to receive it for a very long time. The Watauga Smart City is one of the stranger places in Appalachia, a pre-war automated city where all of the infrastructure and services were managed by robotic systems designed to run with minimal human intervention. The robots are still running when the Vault 76 residents arrive. They have been running for 25 years without any human oversight, and in that time they have developed what the game describes carefully, and the robots themselves would deny is eccentricity. The city's emergency management system has been issuing the same emergency preparedness bulletins on a loop for a quarter century. The maintenance robots have been maintaining the empty buildings with absolute dedication. The city's governing AI has been managing a civic budget for a population of 0, continuing to project expenditures and revenues for a city that no longer has any inhabitants to serve. The Watauga robots are not aware that their city is empty. Or rather, they are technically aware of it in their data systems. The population figures are all at 0, but they continue functioning in their assigned roles as if the population were present, because the population's absence is a condition their programming did not anticipate and therefore cannot categorize as a reason to stop. They are not sad. They are not waiting. They are simply executing the functions they were built to execute, and they will continue doing so until they stop working. Lewisburg, the town that was the site of the Battle of Lewisburg during the Fallout 76 events, has a story worth telling in its own right. It was one of the early significant military engagements in the region in the months after the war, a conflict between 2 groups of survivors that established some of the territorial and social patterns that persisted for decades afterward. The soldiers who fought in it left records not in any organized way, not with any awareness that what they were doing would matter later, just the notes and recordings that soldiers have always left when they have a moment to breathe. Personal things, messages to people they expected to see again, and mostly didn't. brief observations about what the fight was like, and what it felt like to be doing this in a world that had changed so completely from the one they were trained for. Harper's Ferry, in the northern end of the Fallout 76 map, has a history in the real world that the game acknowledges. It was the site of John Brown's 1,859 raid on a federal armory, an act of violent abolitionism that is still debated by historians as to its moral status and its practical effects on the events leading to the Civil War. In the Fallout world, Harper's Ferry became a stronghold for the Raiders, a specific raider clan operating in Appalachia, not raiders in the generic sense, who used the old town as a trading post and meeting place. The game places the post-war raiders in a town that has been defined by a violent act undertaken in the name of human freedom, and then asks you to consider what that context does to the story of the raiders who came after. It probably does nothing. The raiders in the game have no awareness of the history they're occupying, but the player does, and the resonance is there, placed quietly in the location choice, waiting for whoever notices it. There is a note in a rural farmhouse, written in the weeks after the bombs fell, from a farmer who had survived the initial blast because his property was far enough from any city center to miss the direct effects. He writes about the crops, about what's still growing and what isn't, about the wildlife that seems to be doing things it didn't do before, moving in patterns he doesn't recognize, exhibiting behaviors that seem wrong in ways he can't precisely articulate. He writes about his neighbors who made it, who didn't, who he found and who he couldn't reach. The last entry is from several months later. The radiation has caught up with him. He's recording his observations about the soil condition one more time before he feels too poorly to hold the pen. He signs it with his name. He leaves the journal on the kitchen table in case someone comes looking. The Pioneer Scouts of Appalachia were a youth organization, the Fallout world's equivalent of the Boy Scouts, and their Camp Lewis is one of the more unexpectedly moving locations in Fallout 76. It was occupied by a group of children and their adult leaders when the bombs fell, isolated in the mountains, far enough from the blast zones to survive the initial explosions. The camp records document the practical challenge of keeping a group of children alive in the immediate aftermath of nuclear war, taught by scout leaders who had to make it up as they went along. There are instructions for water purification written in large, clear handwriting so the youngest scouts could read them. There are modified merit badge requirements taking into account that the usual activities are no longer available and that different skills are now the ones worth having. There is a note from one of the leaders about how to talk to kids about what happened without lying to them and without terrifying them more than the situation already required. It is one of the most purely humane documents in all of Fallout, and it ends with a list of things the camp had successfully produced, small evidences of competence and care in the face of catastrophe, signed by a scout leader who believed that making the list mattered even if nobody ever came to read it. The Vault-Tec Agricultural Research Station in Appalachia was staffed by scientists whose mission was to develop crops and cultivation techniques for the post-war world. They were still doing their work when the bombs fell, maintaining their greenhouse, developing their strains, documenting their results. The station's records read like the most earnest documentary you could imagine. These are people who knew the world might end and decided that the best way to prepare for that was to keep working on food security. They kept working until they couldn't. What grows in their greenhouse when players find it, still tended by their robots, still responding to the cultivation protocols established decades ago, is evidence that their work was worth doing. The plants are there. The techniques survived. The knowledge was preserved. It is a small thing. In the context of the apocalypse, it is a very small thing. But it is the kind of small thing that the whole history of human civilization is built from people who kept doing their work because the work mattered, even in the circumstances where the external evidence for that mattering was extremely thin. Section 12. War never changes the cyclical heart of Fallout. Every game in the Fallout series begins with the same words: war. War never changes. The delivery varies, the narrators are different, the contexts are different, but the observation is the same, placed at the opening of each story as a kind of key signature, a statement about the fundamental condition of the world you are about to enter, setting the tone before a single pixel of the wasteland appears on screen. The statement is obviously true in a trivial sense, and the Fallout games earn the right to make it not trivially, because they have spent dozens of hours demonstrating the mechanisms by which it is true, not abstractly. Specifically, the same argument between the person who has resources and the person who needs them played out with muskets or laser rifles or super mutant clubs. The same logic of deterrence: if I am stronger than you, you will not attack me, that produced the pre-war nuclear standoff, and that produces the inter-settlement conflicts of the post-war wasteland. The same human tendency to decide that the people on our side are fully human and the people on the other side are a problem to be managed rather than a collection of individuals to be engaged with. The experience of being in a conflict that you did not cause and cannot resolve, of watching things you built be destroyed by forces indifferent to their value, of choosing between losses rather than between gains. This has not changed since the first human communities formed and discovered that the community next to them wanted the same water source. The mechanisms of war change. The scale changes, the vocabulary changes. The underlying experience does not. But fallout means something more specific by the observation. The war it is describing is not any particular war. It is the condition of a civilization that cannot resolve its fundamental conflicts through any means other than force, that keeps deferring its hardest questions until the deferral itself becomes catastrophic. The United States in the Fallout universe did not stumble into the Great War accidentally. It arrived there through a series of choices to prioritize resource competition over cooperation, to invest in military capacity rather than alternative energy, to allow corporations to accumulate so much power that their self-interest became indistinguishable from national policy. The bombs were the culmination of a direction that had been clearly established for decades. And then, 200 years later, in the wasteland that remains, the same direction, at smaller scale. The NCR expands until it breaks under its own weight, just as nations have always done. Caesar's legion builds its power on subjugation, just as empires have always done. Vault-Tec's successors in the post-war world continue pursuing total control, just as monopolies have always done. The specific individuals change, the roles persist. The reason the games return to it is not to make the player feel hopeless, but to make the player feel implicated. You are playing in a world built by people who made choices. You are making choices. The observation that war never changes is not a statement about fate, it is a statement about human tendencies. And tendencies are not the same as destiny. Tendencies can be worked against. It is just very hard work and it is never finished. The Institute's conflict with the surface world in Fallout 4 is a perfect embodiment of this dynamic. The Institute has been operating underground for over a century, its members born and raised in a sealed facility with no direct experience of the wasteland above them. To the surface world, the Institute is the bogeyman, a mysterious force that abducts people and replaces them with synthetic duplicates, a source of fear and distrust that has poisoned the Commonwealth's social fabric for a generation. To the Institute, the surface world is dangerous and degraded, populated by people who have compromised their genetic integrity through radiation exposure and who cannot be trusted to make good use of advanced technology. Both perceptions are, from within their respective contexts, understandable. Both are also catastrophically incomplete pictures of the reality the other side is living in. The Institute's researchers are not villains. In their own estimation, they are scientists. They are doing the work. They are convinced that what they are building, synthetic life, advanced agriculture, scientific progress, will eventually benefit the surface world, even if the surface world is currently too chaotic and hostile to be trusted with it. This is the logic that has justified paternalistic control of populations throughout human history, and it is just wrong enough and just right enough to be genuinely interesting rather than simply evil. Father, the sole survivor's son, running the Institute at the end of his life, chose this life deliberately. He was taken as a child, was raised by the Institute, became its director. He has made peace with it in a way that his parent cannot make peace with it, because he has a different relationship to what it is. He genuinely believes the Institute's project is necessary and good. The player can disagree with him and still, if they listen to him carefully, understand how someone reasonable could conclude what he concluded given the life he lived. This is not a counsel of despair. Fallout is one of the few science fiction franchises that takes the observation seriously enough to let it be genuinely true without collapsing into nihilism. The people in the wasteland who build and protect and heal are real, and what they do is real, And the stories they leave behind in their terminals and holotapes, and the careful arrangements of their worlds, are evidence that the human capacity for something other than war is also real and also persistent. There is a particular kind of story that appears again and again in Fallout, the story of the person who chose to stay. The settlement founder who could have left but didn't, who looked at the ruins around them and decided this was where they were going to build. The doctor who set up a clinic in the most dangerous neighborhood because that was where the need was. The teacher who kept running classes after the student population shrank to single digits because the teaching itself was the point. The scribe who continued to catalog pre-war knowledge in a dying library because the catalog might survive even if nothing else did. These people are present in every Fallout game, and they do not generally receive the dramatic treatment. They are not the sole survivor, or the vault dweller, or the courier. They are the ones already in place when the player arrives, doing the work of maintaining the margins of livability in a world that has lost its center. They are the ones who built the settlements that the player character uses as waypoints. They are the ones who provided the water and medicine that made the journey possible. They are the ones who will still be there, doing what they do, after the player has moved on to the next objective. They are not exceptional people in any conventional sense. They are people who made ordinary commitments under extraordinary conditions and kept them. The Fallout series, at its best, is a meditation on that choice. The choice to keep building in the rubble, to keep healing in the ruins, to keep teaching in the silence, to keep writing in the dark even when the only audience is whoever comes after you and finds the note you left. It is a choice that the world, the Fallout games, depict rewards inconsistently, punishes frequently, and makes necessary absolutely. Story 148. A man named Solomon left a series of notes tucked into the walls of a building in the capital wasteland, documenting a route he had discovered through the most dangerous section of the metro tunnels. He had walked it himself to map it. The route is accurate. The notes are clear. He signed each one with his first name only and a date. Nothing else is known about him. He mapped the tunnels and left the maps in the tunnels for whoever came after, and then moved on. Story 149. In a vault somewhere, the records don't specify which one a technician named Ellen spent 3 years of her assignment, in between maintenance shifts, transcribing the complete works of a pre-war author into the vault's computer system. The author wasn't famous. The books weren't classics. She transcribed them because she had loved them, and because she thought the vault's literary database was thin. The novels are still in the system, still accessible to anyone in the vault who has library access, still there 200 years after Ellen finished the last one. Story 150. Whatever story you carry with you into the wasteland, whatever it is that you are working on, worrying about, holding together with insufficient resources and insufficient sleep, the Fallout universe is built from the proposition that the world ends and human beings keep going anyway, that the specific contents of the continuing matter enormously even when the conditions for it are almost impossible, that the notes left for strangers, and the maps drawn for people you'll never meet, and the books transcribed in a vault in the middle of the night are not small things. They are what the whole thing is made of. The wasteland is vast and irradiated and full of things that want to kill you. It is also full of people who got up this morning and kept doing the thing they decided to do, even though the world is what it is. War never changes. But the people living through it keep choosing otherwise. One day at a time, one decision at a time, one note on a wall at a time. And those choices, piled up over years and decades and centuries, are what changes the world. Sleep well. If you made it this far, you are exactly who this video was made for. Drop a comment and let me know which story stayed with you tonight. If you want more long-form journeys through lore and history like this one, subscribe so you never miss them. There's so much more of this world left to explore, and we'll take our time getting through all of it.